He had more land than any man in Wyoming could ride across in a single day, more cattle than most counties combined, and enough money to buy silence from anyone who asked too many questions. But on the morning a woman showed up at his gate with nothing but a cast iron skillet and a dead woman's letter, Bo Ashford discovered that all of it, every acre, every dollar, every head of cattle, meant absolutely nothing without someone willing to fight for it beside him. If you've ever wondered what it costs a man to finally stop running from himself, stay until the end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The letter arrived the same morning the frost cracked the water troughs. Bo Ashford didn't read it right away. He was already in the yard before sunrise, standing in mud that sucked at his boots, watching two of his men argue over a fence post that had heaved out of the ground overnight. The post wasn't the problem. The problem was that everything on the Ashford ranch had been quietly going wrong for months. The way things do when there's no one at the center holding it together. Small failures stacking on top of each other until the weight becomes something you can feel in your chest before you even open your eyes in the morning. His foreman, Dale Pruitt, found him there with the envelope. Dale was a thick-necked man in his late 40s who'd worked the Ashford land since Bo's father was still alive and walking these same fields. He didn't offer opinions unless asked, and rarely asked for anything himself. That made him trustworthy in Bo's estimation, which was a short list. Came with the supply wagon, Dale said, holding out the envelope. From Clearwater. Bo looked at it without taking it for a moment. Clearwater was the town 30 miles southeast, and he hadn't left the ranch in 6 weeks. He had no reason to expect anything good from that direction. He took the letter and shoved it in his coat pocket. What's the damage on that fence line? 3 posts along the north pasture. Could have been frost heave. Could have been something else. Fix it either way. He spent the next 3 hours out with the crew, and when he finally came back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, he pulled out the envelope and opened it. The handwriting was shaky. Old. Mr. Ashford, my name is Ruth Garland. I believe you knew my sister Clara. She worked for your family for 11 years before she passed this past October. I am writing to ask a favor on behalf of a young woman named Evelyn Cross, who was a great comfort to Clara in her final weeks. Clara spoke highly of your family, and she asked Evelyn, with her dying breath as near as I can tell, to look in on the Ashford Ranch and see that things were in order. I know this is an unusual request. Evelyn is a capable woman and means no imposition. She asks only for the chance to cook one meal. Yours respectfully, Ruth Garland Bo read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the cold, empty kitchen around him. Clara Withers had been their housekeeper for over a decade. She'd come to work for his father when Bo was still in his teens, and she'd stayed through everything. Through the years when the ranch struggled, through the drought of '81, through his father's death and Bo taking over, through the slow transformation of the Ashford spread from a working ranch into something closer to an empire. Clara had cooked for the hands, managed the house, scolded anyone who tracked mud past the threshold, and kept the whole interior of the property running with a quiet authority that no one ever thought to question. She'd died of fever in October, and the kitchen had been wrong ever since. They'd gone through 2 hired women in the months since. The first quit after 2 weeks because, in her words, the men were rough and the hours were unreasonable. The second had lasted 3 days. The kitchen now sat in a state that could only be described as organized neglect, functional in the bare minimum sense, producing food that kept people alive without making anyone feel like anything was worth eating. Bo didn't need a stranger from Clearwater showing up to solve his problems. He'd managed this ranch for 6 years on his own terms, and he'd manage it 6 more. He picked up the letter again. She asks only for the chance to cook one meal. He thought about that for a moment. Then he folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and set it on the corner of the table where he'd remember to throw it away later. So, Evelyn Cross arrived 4 days after he'd decided not to respond. He was in the barn when Dale came to find him, wearing the particular expression that meant something unexpected had happened, and Dale wasn't sure how to characterize it. "Woman at the gate," he said. "Says she has a letter." Bo didn't look up from the harness he was mending. "Send her away." "I told her you weren't expecting anyone." "And?" "She said she'd wait." He did look up then. "She'd wait. Out at the gate. She's got a bag and what looks like a cast iron pan. Been standing there about 20 minutes already." Bo set down the harness and walked out of the barn into the late afternoon cold. He could see her from the yard, a woman standing just outside the gate at the end of the drive, maybe 30 yards off, wearing a coat that had seen better years and holding herself very still in the wind. Not fidgeting, not pacing, just standing there like she had all the time available to her and wasn't particularly troubled by how much of it she might have to spend waiting. He walked up to the gate and looked at her through the iron bars. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back under a wool hat and eyes that were calm in a way that most people's aren't when they're standing in the cold being stared at by a man who hasn't invited them onto his property. She was holding a canvas bag in one hand and a Dutch oven in the other, just as Dale had described. "You're Evelyn Cross," he said. "I am. I didn't respond to that letter." "I know. That generally means no." "It generally means nothing," she said. "A person who reads a letter and decides not to answer it hasn't made a decision. They've just waited." He studied her. "You've got some nerve coming out here." "I've been told that before." She didn't say it with any pride or apology, just as a fact. "Clara Withers was my friend. She asked me to come. I'm here." "Clara's dead, which is why I'm standing outside your fence instead of leaving." She shifted the Dutch oven from one hand to the other. It was clearly heavy. She didn't complain about it. "I'm not asking for a job, Mr. Ashford. I'm asking to cook one meal. If it's bad, I'll leave. If it's good, you can decide what you want to do about it after that." Bo looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who'd learned to read people the way you read weather. Not by what they said, but by how they held themselves when they weren't performing anything. Evelyn Cross didn't appear to be performing anything. He reached forward and unlatched the gate. "One meal," he said. "Kitchen's that way." The Ashford Ranch House was a two-story timber structure that had been built by his grandfather in 1857 and added on to twice since then. It wasn't fancy in the way of the houses going up in Cheyenne, but it was solid and large, with wide plank floors and enough fireplaces to keep every room warm through the deepest part of winter. The kitchen was at the back of the ground floor, with a window that looked out over the south pasture and a cast-iron stove that could heat a small county if you fed it right. When Evelyn walked in and set her bag on the table, she was quiet for a moment, just looking around. Bo watched her from the doorway. "When did Clara pass?" she asked. "October 15th. She nodded slowly. She was looking at the shelves, at the arrangement of supplies, at the cold stove. "Has anyone used this kitchen since then?" "For cooking, not for much else." She touched the edge of the stove and then opened the firebox and looked inside. "It's been burning too hot on the left side. The damper's probably warped." He hadn't known that. "Can you fix it? Tonight I can cook around it. Tomorrow someone can look at the damper." She straightened and turned to the shelves, moving along them slowly, reading the labels on jars and canisters. She opened a flour sack and checked the contents, pressed her thumb into a block of salt, lifted the lid off a pot, and looked at what was inside. She did all of this without commentary, like someone taking stock of a situation rather than performing an inspection. "How many men are you feeding?" she asked. "Tonight, 11, plus me." "Any preferences or complaints I should know about?" "Hank Morse doesn't eat pork. Burns his stomach. Otherwise, eat what you're given." She nodded, opened her canvas bag and began setting things on the counter. A bundle of dried herbs, 2 jars she'd brought herself, something wrapped in paper that turned out to be a piece of smoked bone. Bo watched her for another minute and then left her to it. He didn't mean to pay attention to what was happening in the kitchen for the next 2 hours. He had ledgers to review and a letter to write to his attorney in Laramie about a grazing rights dispute that had been dragging on since spring. He sat at his desk in the front room and tried to focus on both. But the smell started coming through the floorboards around 6 o'clock, and once it started, it was hard to ignore. It wasn't complicated cooking. He could tell that much. It was beef stew with biscuits, from what he could identify. Nothing that would have been out of place at any ranch table in the territory. But there was something underneath the simple smell of it, something that had been absent from this house for nearly 4 months, something that lived in the difference between food made in a hurry for men who needed fuel and food made by someone who'd decided those men were worth feeding properly. He heard voices from the kitchen at 6:30. Low at first, then someone laughed. A real laugh. Not the short, obligatory kind you get from men who are politely pretending something is funny. He got up and stood in the doorway. Three of his hands, Tommy Fitch, the youngest of the crew at 19, along with Cleet Bowman and Red Hargrave, who'd both been working the ranch for years, had drifted into the kitchen from wherever they'd been and were now standing near the back wall watching Evelyn work. She was talking to them while she moved around the stove, not stopping, not turning to face them, just talking in that steady way she had. And Tommy Fitch was grinning at something she'd said like he'd forgotten to stop. Not saying you need to chop it fine, she was telling Cleet, who appeared to be holding a knife and looking confused about what he was supposed to do with it. Just rough. The knife doesn't need to be perfect, just needs to be moving. I'm not much of a cook, Cleet said. I noticed. But you're holding the knife right, which is more than I can say for some people. Red Hargrave made a noise that was close to a laugh. Cleet looked both insulted and pleased at the same time. Bo stayed in the doorway without announcing himself. He hadn't heard his kitchen sound like this since Clara was alive. He hadn't realized, until this moment, how much he'd forgotten that it used to. They ate at the long table in the back room, which was where the hands took their meals. Bo sat at the head of it, as he always did, but tonight the table was different, not in any obvious way, not because anything had changed structurally, but because people were sitting differently, not hunched over their plates the way they'd been for months. Hank Morse was talking to Dale about something that had nothing to do with work. Tommy Fitch ate 3 helpings and looked vaguely amazed by this fact. The stew was good. Better than good, actually. It had the kind of depth to it that usually required more ingredients than Bo could identify in the pot. And the biscuits had that particular weight to them that meant they'd been made by someone who knew what they were doing. He ate and said nothing, watching the table. Evelyn sat near the far end. She'd made herself a plate without asking permission and sat down among the men without any particular fanfare. A couple of them had glanced at her awkwardly at first, unsure of the protocol maybe, or uncertain how to behave around a woman at the table who wasn't attached to any of them. But she'd started asking Dale Pruitt about the north fence line before the awkwardness could settle, and Dale, who rarely opened up to anyone, had found himself explaining the frost heave problem in more detail than he'd offered Bo all week. Bo watched that too. After the meal, when most of the men had drifted back outside or toward the bunkhouse, Evelyn stayed to clean the kitchen. Bo came in and found her standing at the wash basin, working through the stack of pots and dishes with the same unhurried efficiency she'd brought to everything else. You can leave those, he said. It's late. I made the mess, she said. I'll clean it. He pulled a chair out from the table and sat down. Where'd you come from before Clearwater? She didn't look up from the wash basin. Kansas before that. And before that, other places. Family? A brief pause. Not anymore. He let that sit without pushing it. How'd you end up with Clara? I was working at a boarding house in Clearwater when she took sick last summer. The woman who ran the house asked me to look in on her since we were neighbors. She set a pot on the drying rack. Clara was one of those people who talks to you like she's known you for years. By the time she was really ill, I was spending most of my evenings with her. She paused again. She talked about this ranch a lot, about your father, about you. Bo shifted in his chair. What did she say? Evelyn turned to look at him for a moment. It was a direct, considered look. She said you worked too hard and thought too much, and let yourself be too alone. She turned back to the wash basin. She said the ranch had lost its heart when your father died, and it hadn't found one since. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove crackled once, settled. She was right, Bo said. Evelyn didn't respond to that. She finished the pot she was washing and started on the next one. You said one meal, Bo said after a minute. I held you to that. You've made it. He paused. So what do you want? She set down the pot and dried her hands on the towel hanging from the oven rail. She turned to face him. I'd like to stay for a week, she said. No wages. Room and board is enough. At the end of the week, you tell me yes or no, and I'll accept whichever answer you give. A week's a long time. It's enough time to see if the kitchen works. The kitchen works fine. She looked at him with the same calm, direct expression she'd had standing outside the gate. Mr. Ashford, with respect? No, it doesn't. He didn't argue. He couldn't, really. He'd eaten 12 meals in a row from that kitchen before tonight and hadn't thought any of them were worth sitting down for. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't fill the silence with reassurances or pleading. She just waited, the way she'd waited outside the gate. "There's a room at the end of the upstairs hall," he said. "It's small. Clara used it." "That's fine. You'll need to be up before the men." "I'm always up before most people." He stood from the chair and set it back against the table. "Don't rearrange things without telling me first." "I'll tell you what I'm doing before I do it," she said. That was more than most people offered. He nodded once and walked out of the kitchen. A seat. He heard her moving around upstairs for a while after that, the quiet sounds of someone settling into an unfamiliar room. A drawer opening, a window being checked, the soft creak of the floor. He lay in his own room at the far end of the hall and listened to those sounds until they stopped. He'd run this ranch alone for 6 years. He'd made every decision, solved every problem, absorbed every loss without letting anyone close enough to see the weight of it. That was how he'd been built. By his father, by the land, by the particular kind of man Wyoming produced in those years, the kind that measured competence by what he could handle without help. Clara Withers had been the exception. She'd been part of the furniture, almost, in the way that people become when they've been around long enough. Present, reliable, woven into the fabric of the place. He hadn't understood what she was holding together until she was gone. Now there was a stranger sleeping at the end of the hall. He thought about what she'd said at dinner, relaying Clara's words without any softening. "You worked too hard and thought too much and let yourself be too alone." Not kind, exactly. Not unkind either. Just the truth delivered flat, the way you'd report the weather. He fell asleep before he'd decided what to think about that. She was up before him, as she'd promised. He came downstairs at 4:30 to find the kitchen lit and warm, the stove already burning at the right temperature, and Evelyn standing at the counter working dough with both hands, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She looked up when he walked in, and then looked back at what she was doing. "Coffee's on the left burner," she said. He poured a cup and stood there, not quite awake yet. "You didn't sleep." "I slept enough. I always wake early." She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough and folded it over. "I found where the supplies are kept. A lot of it is in the wrong order. Things are harder to find than they need to be. I want to reorganize the shelves today if you don't object." He thought about what he'd said the night before. "Don't rearrange things without telling me." She was telling him. "Go ahead. The feed stock in the pantry should be rotated. Some of the dry goods in the back are older than they should be. I won't throw anything out without asking." "You can use your judgment," he said, which surprised him slightly as he said it. She glanced at him. "That's more trust than most people extend to someone they've known less than 12 hours. You haven't given me a reason not to yet." She went back to the dough. He drank his coffee by the window, watching the dark outside turn the particular gray that came before any color returned to the sky. "The fence posts on your north pasture," she said after a while. "3 of them went overnight?" "Last week. Dale thinks frost heave." "Could be." She didn't say anything else for a moment. "I noticed when I came up the drive yesterday that the grass along the east side of the fence line was pressed down. Not from animals. Wrong pattern for that." He turned from the window. "What kind of pattern?" She stopped working the dough and looked at him. "The kind that comes from people standing around, watching." Bo set his coffee cup down. "Could be nothing," she said. "Could be someone passing through and stopping to rest. But it was more than one person, and they stayed long enough to leave a mark on the ground." He looked at her for a moment. "You noticed that coming up my drive in the dark yesterday afternoon." "I notice things," she said simply. "It's habit." She went back to the dough. Outside, the gray was beginning to lighten. He could hear, faintly, the first sounds of the bunkhouse coming to life. He stood at the window a little while longer, looking out toward the east fence line where the dark was still thick and nothing moved that he could see. But that meant nothing. Dark had always been good at hiding what was in it. He picked up his coffee cup and finished what was left of it. "I'll have Dale check the east fence this morning," he said. Evelyn nodded once, already turning back to what she was doing. The stove crackled. The first pale light started coming in through the kitchen window, laying itself across the plank floor in a thin, uncertain line. The day was beginning. By the end of the first week, several things had happened that Bo hadn't anticipated. The kitchen had become, somehow, the center of the ranch house again. Men who'd been eating in under 10 minutes for months were staying at the table longer. Tommy Fitch had started helping with dishes without being asked, which was something no one had ever done in Beau's memory. Dale Pruitt, who usually ate alone in the bunkhouse when he could manage it, had taken to showing up at the main table more often than not. Evelyn had reorganized the pantry on the second day, and Beau had to admit, when he looked at it afterward, that it made sense in a way the old arrangement hadn't. She'd found a catalog of supply orders Clara had kept from the previous 2 years, and had sat down at the kitchen table one afternoon going through it, making notes on a piece of paper in handwriting that was small and precise, identifying gaps and redundancies. She'd also fixed the damper on the stove herself. He told her to wait for one of the men to look at it. When he'd asked her the next morning how she'd learned to fix a stove damper, she'd said, "Trial and error, mostly, and a winter in Minnesota where the stove not working was a more serious problem than it is here." She didn't offer much beyond what she was asked. That was something he noticed early. She didn't volunteer her history or her opinions unless the situation called for it, and she didn't fill silence with noise the way some people did. She worked, steadily, practically, without fanfare, and she talked to the men in that same easy, direct manner she'd used from the first night, never condescending, never performing warmth she didn't mean. The men had decided, without any formal announcement, that she was all right. Beau trusted their judgment on this more than his own, in some ways. These were men who'd been worked hard and treated honestly for years, and they had a good instinct for the difference between someone who was worth being around and someone who wasn't. On the 6th evening, he found her on the back porch after supper, looking out at the south pasture in the failing light. She had her arms crossed, and she was very still, which he'd come to recognize as what she looked like when she was thinking about something she hadn't resolved yet. "You've been watching the ridge," he said, coming to stand beside her. She didn't seem startled. "Have you had any trouble with the Meridian Land Company?" The name landed in his chest like a stone in water. He went still. "Where did you hear that name?" She turned to look at him. One of the hands, Cleet, I think, mentioned it without meaning to. He was talking about some men who'd been asking around in town a few weeks ago. She paused. "That same name was on some paperwork I noticed in the stack on your desk when I was cleaning the front room. I wasn't reading it. I just saw the name." "What do you know about Meridian?" "Nothing specific," she said. "But a company with that kind of name showing up in a place like this, asking questions about land, 2 or 3 weeks before someone starts watching your fence lines." She turned back to the pasture. "That's not a coincidence that needs a lot of explaining." Beau looked out at the ridge in the distance, the long, dark line of it against the last light of the sky. His grandfather had fenced that ridge in 1862. It had always been the east boundary of the Ashford property. Unremarkable land, rocky, not much good for grazing. That was what everyone had always thought. "They've made me an offer," he said, "through an attorney in Laramie, twice now." She looked at him. "For the whole ranch?" "For the east pasture and the ridge. Just that piece." He paused. "Which is strange, because that's the piece with the least cattle value of anything I own." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking it through, the same way she'd gone through the supply orders, methodically. "The railroad," she said. He looked at her. "There's been talk about a new rail line," she said. "I heard it in Clearwater before I came out here. Nothing definite, but people were talking about a route through the eastern part of the territory." She turned to look at the ridge again. A ridge like that, sitting at the right elevation, with a clear approach from the south. "It'd be worth 10 times what they're offering me," Beau said quietly. "More," she said, "if they get there before anyone figures out what's on that piece of land." The wind came across the pasture, carrying the smell of cold earth and dry grass. Beau stood there looking at the ridge, at the dark line of it against the sky, at the land his grandfather had fenced and his father had maintained and he had defended for 6 years without ever understanding what he was really defending. "A week," he said. "I told you 1 week." She turned and met his eyes, waited. "Stay," he said. "Don't argue about wages. I'll pay you what Clara earned, but stay." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the pasture. "All right," she said. The dark settled in across the south pasture, and the ridge disappeared into it, and Beau Ashford stood on his back porch next to a woman he'd met 6 days ago and felt, for the first time in a long time, like the ground under his feet was solid again. He didn't say that out loud. He wasn't built for saying things like that out loud. but he felt it. The week that followed Beau's decision to keep her on was not a dramatic transformation. That was the first thing worth saying about it. The ranch did not suddenly become a different place overnight, and Evelyn would not have trusted it if it had. Real change in a place like this moved the way ground thawed in early spring, slowly from the inside out, and only if the conditions were right. What happened instead was smaller than transformation, more durable. The men stopped eating like they were fueling machinery and started eating like they were somewhere worth being. That sounds like a minor thing until you understand what it means for a man who's been out in cold and mud and wind since before light, to sit down at the end of it and have something in front of him that someone cared about making. It doesn't fix the cold or the mud or the wind, but it does something to the way a man carries those things. Tommy Fitch was the most obvious case. He was 19 and had been working the Ashford Ranch for 8 months, having drifted up from Colorado with no family to speak of, and a vague plan to save enough money to eventually do something he hadn't figured out yet. Before Evelyn arrived, he'd eaten his meals in under 5 minutes, always sitting at the far end of the table, and gone to bed without talking to anyone. By the end of her first full week, he'd started showing up to the kitchen before supper to ask if she needed help carrying anything, and he'd twice stayed at the table past the point where conversation had naturally wound down, just because the sitting felt easier than the alternative. Evelyn noticed all of this and said nothing about it, which was the right approach. Tommy Fitch didn't need to be commented on. He needed to be treated like he was where he was supposed to be, and that was what she did. Beau noticed it too from a greater distance. He was not a man who spent a lot of time watching the emotional temperature of the people around him. That had never been in his nature, and the years of running this ranch alone had reinforced the habit of looking outward at problems rather than inward at people. But Evelyn had said something that first morning, almost casually, about the grass being pressed down along the east fence, and it had shifted something in the way he was looking at everything. He didn't know exactly how to name what had shifted. It was something like attention, like being reminded that the details mattered. Dale Pruitt had checked the east fence line that same morning and come back with a report that was careful and quiet, delivered to Beau alone in the barn. The ground on the far side of the fence, in the scrub brush that grew thick along the base of the ridge, showed signs that someone had been moving through it. Not one person. At least 2, maybe 3. Moving parallel to the fence line, not crossing it. Not hunters from the pattern of it. Hunters moved towards something. These tracks moved alongside something, the way you move when you're looking at a boundary and thinking about what's on the other side. Beau had told Dale to say nothing to the men for now and to keep his eyes open. Dale had nodded and asked no questions, which was one of the things that made him invaluable. The weeks slid into a routine that felt, to Beau's mild alarm, almost natural. Evelyn was up before 4 every morning without fail. By the time the hands were pulling on their boots in the bunkhouse, there was heat coming from the kitchen and the smell of coffee carrying across the yard in the cold air. She cooked breakfast for 12 men and managed it without apparent difficulty, moving around the kitchen with an economy of motion that had no wasted steps. She didn't rush. She didn't hurry. She just worked at a pace that somehow always produced what was needed when it was needed. Midday, she put together a meal that could be carried out to the fields or eaten at the house, depending on where the work was. Evenings were the sit-down meal, the one that had already done whatever quiet magic it was doing to the spirit of the crew. She rotated through what the ranch could provide. Beef in more forms than Beau would have thought possible, supplemented by dried goods and the preserves she'd found misorganized in the pantry, and occasional things she added to the supply order that arrived from town every 2 weeks with the wagon. She also repaired the supply order itself. He'd found her, on the 3rd day of her 2nd week, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara's old order books and a piece of paper, working through a list of what the ranch was paying per unit for basic goods against what she calculated those goods should cost based on what she knew from previous work in other kitchens. She'd identified 4 items where the ranch was being consistently overbilled by the supply company in Clearwater. She brought him the list that evening without preamble. "I could be wrong about the market rates on 2 of these," she said, setting the paper on his desk. "But I'm not wrong about the flour or the salt. Someone's been adding margin they're not entitled to." He looked at the numbers. She was right, and the difference over a year was not small. "Clara never caught this?" he asked. "She might have caught it and decided it wasn't worth the trouble," Evelyn said. "Or she might not have had time to cross-reference it. She was running this kitchen alone." She paused. "It's not a criticism. It's just a different set of eyes. He wrote a letter to the supply company in Clearwater the next morning. The rates corrected themselves on the following order without any formal acknowledgement of error, which told him everything he needed to know about whether the overcharging had been intentional. Evelyn said nothing when she noticed the corrected rates on the invoice. She just made a small mark on her ledger and moved on. It was that pattern, the noticing, the marking, the moving on, that he found himself turning over in his mind during the long afternoons when he was out riding the fence lines or sitting through the administrative work that came with running a ranch of this scale. She paid attention to things in a way that wasn't performance and wasn't nosiness. It was just thoroughness. The kind of thoroughness you develop when you've had to figure things out for yourself for a long time, in places where getting it wrong had real consequences. He hadn't asked her again about her past. She'd said not anymore when he'd asked about family, and he'd left it there. He understood the particular quality of that kind of answer, the way it closed a door without hostility, just firmness. He had a few doors like that himself. It was on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after she'd arrived, that the sabotage became impossible to attribute to anything accidental. Bo was in the east pasture with Dale and Red Hargrave, checking on a section of fence that had needed repairs since the frost heave. They found the posts replaced and the wire stretched correctly, which Dale had overseen personally. But 40 yards further along the line, 3 fence posts had been pulled out of the ground entirely and thrown into the brush. Not heaved, pulled. The holes were clean, the earth around them disturbed in a way that said hands and effort, not weather. Red swore under his breath. Dale crouched and looked at the holes. "Last night," Dale said. "Ground's still soft at the edges." "How many men?" Bo asked. "More than 2, maybe 4 or 5, to pull these out that clean." He stood. They knew where to work. East section, away from the house. Bo looked out across the pasture toward the ridge. In the flat winter light, it looked like nothing. A long, low elevation, rocky and brush-covered, unremarkable. He'd walked it himself dozens of times over the years and never thought twice about it. "I want 2 men rotating through the east fence from midnight to 4 every night starting tonight," he said. "Quiet. No lanterns." Dale raised an eyebrow slightly. "You think they'll come back?" "I think whoever this is won't stop until they get an answer from me," Bo said, "one way or another." That evening, he told Evelyn what they'd found. He wasn't sure why he told her, so he didn't make a habit of reporting to anyone about ranch business, and Evelyn wasn't employed in any capacity that made it her concern. But she'd been the one to notice the pressed grass. She'd been the one to say the name Meridian Land Company before he'd raised it himself. Something in the logic of the situation seemed to require that she know. She was standing at the stove when he came in and told her, and she kept working while he talked, stirring, adjusting the heat under a pot. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Have they made contact again?" she asked. "Through the attorney in Laramie?" "Not since October. 2 offers, then silence." "Silence and fence posts," she said. "That's one way to put it." She set down the spoon and turned to face him. "They're trying to make the ranch look ungovernable, difficult to manage. If they can create enough problems, livestock issues, equipment failures, fence breaches, they create a narrative that the property is struggling, which makes any future legal or financial pressure feel more reasonable to an outside party." He looked at her. "You're describing a strategy." "I'm describing what it looks like to me." "How do you know what that looks like?" She picked up the spoon again and turned back to the stove. "I've seen property disputes before," she said. "In Kansas. Different scale, same logic." He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. He let it go. "I need to get a look at whatever documents Meridian's attorney sent me," he said. "The original offer letters. There may be something in the language I missed." "Where are they?" "Filing cabinet in the study. Under L for Laramie." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "You want me to look at them?" He hadn't known that was what he was suggesting until she said it. But yes, apparently, that was what he was suggesting. "You seem to be good at finding things that are in the wrong place." She didn't smile, but something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "After supper," she said. "I'll look at them after supper." He spread the documents out on the kitchen table after the men had cleared out. There were 3 letters in total, 2 offer letters from an attorney named Gerald Whitmore operating out of Laramie, and one accompanying document that described itself as a preliminary survey and proposed boundary agreement related to the East Pasture and Ridge section. Evelyn read through all 3 slowly and without comment. She read the way she did most things, methodically, without performing concentration, just doing it. Bo sat across the table and watched her. "This language here," she said, setting her finger on a paragraph in the second offer letter. "What does your attorney in Laramie say about this clause?" He leaned forward to look. The paragraph in question was dense with legal language about future mineral or resource rights, including but not limited to easements of access and development, pertaining to any and all geographic formations contained within the defined boundary area. He said it was standard language for a land purchase agreement, Bo said. Evelyn looked at him. "It's not standard language. Standard language says what the buyer is buying. This says what the buyer is reserving rights to beyond what they're ostensibly buying." She tapped the paragraph. "If you'd signed this, you wouldn't have sold them the East Pasture. You'd have sold them the East Pasture and granted them permanent access rights to everything above it, including the ridge." Bo went very still. "Your attorney in Laramie," she said carefully. "How long have you worked with him?" "Since my father's time." "And he told you this was standard language." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, the wind moved along the side of the house, and the stove made the low, steady sound of burning wood. "I didn't sign it," Bo said. "I turned down the offer." "I know. I'm saying that if you had signed it, you wouldn't have understood what you'd agreed to until it was too late." She slid the paper toward him. "I'm not saying your attorney is dishonest. I'm saying this language was designed to be read past rather than read carefully. Someone put it there, knowing that most ranchers, people who aren't lawyers, would skip over it." He picked up the document and read the paragraph again, slowly this time, with what she'd said in mind, and he could see it now. The sentence that looked like boilerplate, the phrase "including but not limited to," the careful embedding of the resource rights clause inside language about survey boundaries, the kind of trap that doesn't look like a trap because it looks like paper. "The survey document," he said. What does it say about the ridge elevation?" She pulled it across and looked at the section he meant. Her finger moved along the lines. She stopped. "It lists the ridge at 240 feet above the valley floor," she said. "That's wrong," Bo said. "I've had that ridge surveyed twice. It's 262 feet. She looked up at him. "If their survey is the one on record," he said slowly, "and their survey places the ridge at a different elevation, then the ridge might not be legally within the boundary they're purchasing," she said. "But it would still fall under the easement clause in the second offer letter." They sat with that for a moment. "They drew the purchase boundary to exclude the ridge from the sale price," Bo said, "while the easement clause captures the rights to it anyway." "So you'd have received payment for the pasture land, which isn't worth much," Evelyn said, "and given away the ridge, which is the whole point." He leaned back in his chair. The lamp on the table threw a circle of yellow light across the documents, and outside that circle the kitchen was dark, and the house around it was quiet, and the ridge sat out there in the cold night without knowing it was the thing everything was about. "I need a different attorney," he said. "You need a better survey," she said. "One done by someone you trust, establishing the correct elevation and boundary on record before Meridian can file anything of their own. That's going to take time." "Then we use the time we have." She began stacking the documents neatly, straightening the edges. "How much do you know about who actually owns Meridian Land Company?" "Not much. It's registered in Cheyenne." "Registered in Cheyenne doesn't tell you who's behind it." She set the stack to one side. "A company that sends attorneys and conducts night operations against fence lines doesn't do that without significant capital behind it. Someone with money decided this ridge was worth having before the railroad commits to a route." "Which means someone knows about the railroad route," Bo said, "before it's been publicly announced." She looked at him. "Yes." He tapped his fingers once on the table. He didn't do that often. It was a tell he'd trained himself out of years ago, that particular nervous gesture, but it happened now without his intending it. "I have a contact in the Territorial Land Office," he said. "Man named Aldous Frey. I've dealt with him on grazing rights twice. He's careful, but he's honest." "What do you know about Meridian's filings?" He'd know if Meridian had tried to file anything in the territory. Any survey, any claim, any application for access rights. It would have to go through his office. Evelyn nodded slowly. Can you contact him without Meridian knowing about it? If I ride to the office myself instead of sending a letter? Yes. Then do that, she said, sooner rather than later. She stood from the table and began clearing the lamp to put the kitchen to bed. He gathered the documents and held them for a moment. Evelyn? She looked at him. You said you'd seen this before. In Kansas. A pause. Not a defensive one. More like the pause before deciding what to give and what to keep. My father had land, she said. Not a ranch. A farm, 40 acres, good soil. A water company wanted the water rights to the creek that ran through the eastern edge of it. She went back to clearing the table. They sent an attorney, too, with very standard-looking language. What happened? She didn't answer right away. She set a cup on the shelf above the basin. My father signed what they asked him to, she said, because the attorney was polite and the money seemed fair, and he didn't know what to look for. And then the water rights meant they could redirect the creek. She turned. Without the creek, the eastern 40 weren't workable. The farm went under in 2 years. She looked at him steadily. He didn't lose it through bad luck or hard weather. He lost it because someone wrote a contract he didn't understand, and he trusted that understanding it wasn't his job. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Bo said. Don't be, she said. It was a long time ago, and it's the reason I know what to look for. She picked up the lamp. Good night, Mr. Ashford. Bo, he said. He'd told her once before and she'd reverted. He wasn't sure why it mattered, but it did. She paused at the kitchen doorway. Good night, Bo, she said, and went upstairs. 3 days later, the equipment started failing. It began with the water pump on the south well, a mechanical failure that Dale diagnosed as a broken seal, which was plausible enough given the age of the pump, except that the seal was not worn through, but cut. Clean, deliberate, on the underside where it wouldn't be immediately obvious. Then the blade on the primary hay cutter came loose during morning work and nearly took off 2 of Red Hargrave's fingers. Red was experienced enough to feel the wobble before it went wrong and got clear in time, but it was close. When Dale examined the blade assembly afterward, the bolts had been backed off, not vibrated loose, backed off with a tool, then finger-tightened just enough to hold through the first few minutes of use. Bo stood in the equipment barn looking at the blade assembly and felt something cold move through him that wasn't the temperature. Who knew that cutter was being used this morning? He asked Dale. Anyone who saw the work schedule. I posted on the bunkhouse board, same as always. Bo turned to look at the bunkhouse across the yard. Which means someone who has access to this property knows our schedule. Dale was quiet for a moment. Or someone on the property is passing information outside it. Bo looked at him. I'm not saying I believe it, Dale said carefully. I'm saying it's a possibility we should name. It was the hardest thing Dale had said to him in 6 years. The implications of it sat in the air between them for a moment, heavy and uncomfortable. Don't say it to anyone else yet, Bo said. No, Dale said. I won't. That evening, Bo sat on the back porch in the cold, long after supper had ended, not thinking clearly about any one thing. More like letting the whole shape of the problem sit in front of him and trying to see it from a distance. The ridge was out there in the dark, the same as always. Patient, indifferent, worth more than anyone had known until someone decided to want it. He heard the back door open and Evelyn came out and stood beside him. She had a coat over her shoulders. She looked at the ridge the same way he was looking at it. The pump seal was cut, he said. I heard Dale telling Tommy to be careful on the east side of the south well, she said. I figured it wasn't an accident. The hay cutter, too. She was quiet. Someone is giving them information about our operations, he said. Work schedule, equipment locations. Someone with access. You think it's one of your men. I don't want to. Not wanting to doesn't make it less possible. He turned to look at her. In the dark, her face was mostly shadows, but he could see the steadiness in it. The same steadiness she'd had standing outside his gate, waiting, not troubled by being looked at. What would you do? He asked. She considered that for a moment. I wouldn't try to find out who it is by watching people, she said. That poisons everything if you're wrong, and it poisons things even if you're right. She looked at the ridge. I'd change the schedule. Randomize it. Don't post it on the board. Communicate it to each man separately. Different information, slightly different. If someone outside knows something specific that only one man was told, you'll know. He hadn't thought of that. It was simple, and it was smart, and he hadn't thought of it. And in the meantime, she said, you protect what you can't afford to lose. She turned to look at him. The documents, your survey records, anything on paper that establishes your boundaries and your ownership history. If Meridian can't buy this land and can't trick you into signing it away, the next option is to create enough confusion in the legal record that any claim you make looks disputed. They'd need to file something fraudulent for that. They'd need an opportunity to file something fraudulent, she said. Don't give them one. He looked at her in the dark for a long moment. She was watching the ridge again. You've been thinking about this, he said. Most of the evening, she admitted. I burned the biscuits at supper. He'd noticed the biscuits were darker than usual. He hadn't said anything because they were still fine. Tommy ate 4 of them, he said. Something crossed her face that was close to a smile. Not quite one, but the territory of one. Tommy would eat the pan if I put butter on it. He turned back to the ridge. The cold was settling in hard now, the kind that found the gaps in your coat and sat there. Neither of them moved to go inside. I'm writing to the land office in 2 days, he said, to see Aldous Frey. Good. I want the survey records out of the filing cabinet and somewhere more secure before I leave. I'll take care of it tomorrow. He didn't ask her where she'd put them. He found that he trusted her to choose the right place, which was a strange feeling, not unwelcome, but strange. The kind of trust that doesn't announce itself, just shows up and sits down like it intends to stay. You should go in, he said. It's cold. So should you, she said. He didn't argue. They went inside together, back through the kitchen that smelled of the evening's cooking and the warmth of the stove, and Evelyn put the kettle on without asking if he wanted anything, and he sat at the kitchen table and waited for it to boil, and neither of them said anything for a while, and that was all right. The ridge was out there in the dark, and someone was out there watching it. Aldous Frey worked out of a 2-room office on the 2nd floor of the Territorial Land Building in Cheyenne, which was not the same as Laramie, but was where he'd transferred 18 months prior when the previous director retired. Bo had not known about the transfer. He'd sent 2 letters to the Laramie address over the past year and received one brief response that he'd assumed was delayed by the season. He understood now, riding into Cheyenne on a gray Tuesday morning with cold coming off the mountains to the west, that the letter had been forwarded and the delay had been something else entirely. He left his horse at the livery 2 blocks from the land office and walked the rest of the way with his coat collar up against the wind. Cheyenne was louder than he remembered. More construction, more wagons, more of the particular noise a city makes when money is moving through it faster than the infrastructure can manage. He'd been out at the ranch long enough that the density of it felt slightly wrong, like a sound pitched just high enough to be uncomfortable without being identifiable as the problem. Frey's office was up a narrow staircase that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke. The man himself was behind a desk stacked with files when Bo knocked on the open door, and he looked up with the expression of someone expecting a problem, and confirmed in that expectation by the sight of Bo Ashford standing in his doorway. Bo, he said. He was a lean man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and ink on 2 of his fingers. You didn't write. I didn't want to write, Bo said. I wanted to come myself. Frey studied him for a moment and then gestured to the chair across the desk. Shut the door. Bo sat. The office was cluttered in a way that suggested a specific and personal organizational system that would be incomprehensible to anyone else. Files covered most horizontal surfaces. A large territorial map was pinned to the wall behind the desk, with a 6 different colored pins marking various locations that Bo couldn't interpret from where he sat. Meridian Land Company, Bo said. He watched Frey's face when he said it. What he saw there was not surprise. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation and has mixed feelings about it arriving. What about them? Frey said carefully. They've made 2 offers on my East Pasture and Ridge section. The offers came through a Laramie attorney named Gerald Whitmore. I turned both down. Since then, someone's been conducting operations against my property, fence line tampering, equipment sabotage. He paused. I want to know what Meridian has filed with this office, and I want to know who is behind it. Frey took his reading glasses off his forehead and set them on the desk. He turned them over once in his hands. Outside, the wind pushed against the window glass and made the frame rattle. Meridian filed a preliminary survey claim on a boundary section in the eastern part of Carbon County 6 weeks ago, Frey said. The claim is procedurally correct. It identifies a parcel described as unimproved ridgeland, elevation 240 feet above valley floor, and asserts that the eastern boundary of the Ashford property does not legally extend to include it. Bo felt the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. On what basis? He said. On the basis that your grandfather's original 1857 deed describes the eastern boundary using a creek landmark rather than a fixed survey line, and that the creek has shifted approximately 40 yards west over the past 60 years. Frey set the glasses down. If the creek is the boundary marker, and the creek has moved, the legal argument is that your eastern boundary has also moved, which would place the ridge outside your property. That's... Bo stopped. He made himself slow down before speaking. That's a constructed argument. My father had the property resurveyed in 1879 using fixed elevation markers. The ridge has been within the Ashford boundary on every survey since. I know that, Frey said. I've seen your father's survey. It's in our records. He paused. Meridian is challenging the validity of that survey on the grounds that the surveyor your father hired, a man named Cutler, was not licensed in this territory at the time he performed the work. Was he? I've been trying to verify that for 3 weeks. Frey looked at him steadily. Cutler died in 1884. His licensing records are incomplete. Meridian's attorney filed an affidavit claiming Cutler was unlicensed, which I cannot definitively disprove with what I currently have in this office. The room was very quiet. From somewhere below, the sounds of the building continued. Footsteps, a door, the muffled shape of a conversation. But in this room, it was quiet. Who is behind Meridian? Bo asked. Frey was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant exactly. More like choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that what he said next would have consequences he couldn't fully predict. The company is registered to 3 names. 2 of them are attorneys. Whitmore, your Laramie man, and a Cheyenne attorney named Dorset. The 3rd name is a holding entity called Western Capital Partners. And behind that? That's where it becomes difficult to see clearly. Frey turned in his chair and looked at the map on the wall. There is a significant amount of Eastern capital flowing into territorial land acquisition right now. Men in New York and Philadelphia and Boston who understand that the railroad transforms land values in ways that are difficult to overstate. They employ people out here, attorneys, surveyors, agents, to identify parcels before the routes are confirmed, acquire them quietly, and hold them until the value multiplies. The railroad route, Bo said. It's confirmed? Frey looked at him. Not publicly, but the survey teams have been through your area twice in the past year. Any competent observer would know what that means. And Meridian has competent observers. Meridian has people who have been watching this territory for 2 years, Frey said. Your ridge sits at the ideal elevation for a switching station or a depot approach. The rock formation makes grading straightforward. The approach from the south is clear. He paused. Whoever identified that parcel knew what they were looking at. Bo sat for a moment without speaking. Outside the window, the wind moved through Cheyenne, and below it the city went on making its particular noise of money and motion. He thought about the ridge. He'd ridden past it his entire life without understanding what it was. His grandfather had fenced it because it was the edge of his land, not because he thought it was valuable. His father had resurveyed it as part of a general boundary confirmation, not because anyone was paying specific attention to it. And now someone from the east who'd never set foot on it knew exactly what it was worth. What do I need to do to protect my claim? Bo asked. Frey reached into the lower drawer of his desk and pulled out a folder. You need a new survey performed by a licensed surveyor with unambiguous credentials, establishing the fixed elevation boundary with modern instruments. You need it filed with this office before Meridian's preliminary claim advances to the next procedural stage, which happens in 45 days. 45 days. That's the window. Frey set the folder on the desk but didn't open it. You also need to address the Cutler licensing question. I've been looking for records and haven't found the right ones yet. If you can find documentation that establishes Cutler was legally operating in this territory in 1879, Meridian's challenge to your father's survey collapses. Where would that documentation be? Anywhere that kept professional licensing records in the territory during that period. The Surveyors Guild in Denver had a territorial chapter. The county recorder in Rawlins processed licensing applications for Carbon County at that time. He paused. It's also possible Cutler himself kept records, correspondence, receipts, a professional journal. If he had family, or if any of his estate papers survived. I'll find them, Bo said. Frey looked at him carefully. Bo, Meridian has attorneys, capital, and 2 years of preparation. I want you to understand what you're working against. I understand it. The sabotage you're describing, the fence line, the equipment, that's designed to wear you down and create documentation of an unmanaged property. If this goes to a territorial judge and Meridian can argue that your property has been in disarray, that works against you. Then I won't let it go to a judge in disarray, Bo said. Frey studied him. Then he nodded once, slowly. 45 days, he said. Don't miss it. Bo rode back to the ranch through the afternoon, the cold at his back now as the mountains threw shadow across the high plains. He pushed the horse harder than was necessary and arrived home after dark, which was unusual enough that Dale was waiting in the yard when he rode in. He didn't say much that night. He put the horse up himself and went inside and told Evelyn what Frey had told him, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the house quiet around them, the men all in the bunkhouse. She listened without interrupting. He'd noticed early that she did that, listened to a thing completely before responding to it, which was rarer than it should have been. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 45 days for the survey, she said. Yes. And the Cutler records? Yes. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Denver and Rawlins, she said, half to herself. What was the county seat for Carbon County in 1879? Rawlins. It's been Rawlins since the county was organized. She nodded. The county recorder's office in Rawlins would have the most direct record. If Cutler applied for a territorial license, or if someone applied on his behalf as part of a survey contract, there would be paperwork. If it survived, county records from the 1870s usually survive in some form, she said. They don't always survive organized, but they survive. She looked up at him. I know someone in Rawlins. He raised an eyebrow. A woman I worked with in Kansas. She moved to Rawlins 3 years ago, married a man who works at the county courthouse. She paused. I can write to her. If the records are there, she'll know where to look, and she'll look without making noise about it. Why without noise? Because if Meridian has people watching this ranch, they may have people watching what we do from this ranch. A letter to the county recorder's office from Bo Ashford would be noticed. A personal letter to an old friend might not be. He sat with that for a moment. She was right, and the fact that she'd already thought 3 steps ahead of the most obvious move was something he'd stopped being surprised by and started being simply grateful for. Write the letter, he said. The following week was the hardest kind of hard. The kind where nothing dramatic happens, but the pressure doesn't stop. 2 more fence sections were tampered with on the west side of the property, which was unexpected. Meridian had focused on the east, and the move west felt like a deliberate expansion of the harassment, designed to spread the crew thin. Bo reassigned night watch rotations and stopped posting the schedule on the bunkhouse board, communicating each man's assignment separately the way Evelyn had suggested. It was cumbersome, and the men didn't love it, but it held. The deliberate variation in information started showing results on the 9th day. He told Cleet Bowman, and only Cleet, that the crew would be clearing brush along the south fence on a particular Wednesday morning. The other men had been told a different assignment for that time. When Wednesday came, 3 strangers were seen watching the south fence from the hill above it for 2 hours before moving off. Bo found Cleet in the tack room that afternoon. He didn't accuse him. He walked in and sat on a saddle rack and looked at him for a long moment. Cleet was a compact, capable man of about 40 who'd worked the Ashford land for 4 years. He wasn't the type Bo would have suspected, which was why, when the information tested positive, it felt like something tearing quietly inside the chest. I'm not going to make you say it, Bo said, but I need you to hear something. Whatever they offered you, or told you, or threatened you with, they are not going to give you what they promised. Men like that don't pay the people they use. They just use them until they don't need to anymore. Cleet didn't say anything. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, and he was looking at the floor, and his hands were clenched between his knees. "How long?" Bo asked. A pause. "Since October," Cleet said. His voice was flat and quiet. "Man came through town. Said it was just information, said it wouldn't hurt anyone. Information about the schedule, the equipment, where the fence posts were anchored." Cleet's jaw was tight. "Yeah." Bo stayed very still. He was aware of wanting to say something that would be satisfying to say, something with anger behind it, something that would fill the size of the betrayal. He didn't do it. "You're done here," he said. "Collect your pay from Dale. I want you off the property by morning." Cleet nodded. He didn't protest and didn't justify himself further, which in a strange way Bo respected more than he would have respected an explanation. He told Evelyn that evening. She received the information the way she received most hard things, quietly, without theatrics. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know it's not the same as losing a man you trusted for years, but it's still a loss." "I hired him," Bo said. "I should have read him better. People who are going to betray something don't usually show it in advance," she said. "That's what makes it work." She paused. "The important thing now is that whoever he was reporting to knows their inside access is gone, which means the next move is more likely to be overt." She was right, though it took him a few days to see how right. The letter from Gerald Whitmore arrived 10 days after Cleet left the ranch. It was not an offer this time. It was, formally speaking, a legal notice. Notification that Meridian Land Company had filed a competing boundary claim with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, and that the Ashford Ranch's eastern boundary was now subject to formal dispute. The notice included a summary of the Cutler licensing challenge and a paragraph that suggested, in language that was careful and precise and deeply threatening beneath its formality, that the property would be subject to a court-ordered survey if the dispute was not resolved through negotiated sale within 30 days. 30 days. 15 days less than the 45 Frey had given him. He read the notice 3 times. Then he folded it and set it on the desk and went to find Evelyn, which was the thing he did now when something landed hard enough to require a second perspective. She read it at the kitchen table. He watched her face go through a sequence of careful, contained expressions. Recognition, calculation, something that might have been controlled anger, before settling into the focused stillness that meant she was working. "They know you went to Frey," she said. "Probably." "So they moved the timeline." She set the notice down. 30 days instead of 45, pressure you into the negotiated sale before you can secure your documentation. "Yes." She looked at the notice again. This phrase, court-ordered survey. Do you know what judge would hear this? Territorial court. I'd have to check which judge is assigned to Carbon County cases right now. "Check," she said. "Because a court-ordered survey doesn't solve your problem if the surveyor conducting it has any relationship with Meridian, and a judge who assigned a compromised surveyor..." She stopped. "Check the judge first." He wrote to Frey that evening by express, the fastest mail he could arrange. The response came back in 4 days. Frey was thorough, and what it contained about the likely assigned judge was neither reassuring nor alarming. Judge Warren Cahill was a territorial appointment of 3 years standing with no direct connection to Meridian that Frey could identify. But he had a pattern of ruling in favor of formally documented claims over historically held ones, which meant that whoever had the better paperwork was likely to prevail regardless of who had the better history. Better paperwork, better documentation. The letter from Evelyn's friend in Rollins arrived the same week. Her name was Margaret Solis, and she'd written back in a compact, practical hand that reminded Bo slightly of Evelyn's own. The letter was 3 pages, which was more than Evelyn had expected, and she read it at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee while Bo stood at the stove and waited with the patience he had to consciously maintain. "She found him," Evelyn said, without looking up. "Found what?" "Found Cutler." She turned a page. Not his license directly, but a contract registry. Carbon County kept a registry of contracts for professional services filed with the county recorder. In 1879, a survey contract was filed between your father, Henry Ashford, and a surveyor named James Cutler for the purpose of establishing fixed boundary markers on the Ashford eastern property line. The contract is countersigned by the county recorder and references Cutler's professional standing under a Colorado territorial license number. Say mais was palane. Bo set down his coffee cup. A Colorado license. Cutler was licensed in Colorado, not Wyoming territory, she said, which is what Meridian's affidavit claims, that he wasn't licensed in this territory. She set the letter down and looked at him. But here's what Meridian's affidavit doesn't address. In 1879, Wyoming territory had a reciprocity agreement with Colorado for licensed surveyors. A Colorado license was valid for territorial work in Wyoming under that agreement. Where is the reciprocity agreement documented? Margaret found a reference to it in the county records. A circular distributed to county recorders in 1878 establishing the terms. She picked up the letter again. She's having a certified copy made of the contract registry entry and the 1878 circular. She'll send them by express to Frey's office directly. He stood very still for a moment. That defeats the Cutler challenge. It defeats Meridian's version of it, she said carefully. It doesn't guarantee anything. A good attorney can always find another angle. But it removes their primary argument against your father's survey, which means the 1879 boundary stands, which means the ridge is yours. She set the letter on the table and looked at him. He was aware, in a way he wasn't always, of how much of this had moved because of her. The friend in Rawlins, the careful reading of the offer letters, the identification of the easement clause, the test of the schedule information that had found Cleet. None of it had been dramatic. None of it had been the kind of action a man looks back on and tells a story about. It had been attention, methodical and sustained, applied to the problem in front of them without noise or performance. I need to get this to Frey before Meridian files anything further, he said. Margaret is sending it express. It should reach Frey within the week. And the survey. I need to have a licensed surveyor on this property. Someone unimpeachable. Within 30 days. Do you know anyone? He thought about it. There's a firm in Denver, Barker and Sons. My father used them for a different property line in 1882. Paid them well, never had a dispute with their work. The principal, Thomas Barker, is the kind of man who doesn't trim his findings for anyone. Then send for him today, she said. He didn't wait. He wrote the letter to Barker before noon and sent it express out of the nearest telegraph relay station by mid-afternoon, riding himself rather than sending a hand, because some things needed the certainty of your own hands doing them. On the way back, in the late afternoon with the light going flat and cold over the high plain, he let himself think about what they were actually dealing with, not the tactics and the documents and the procedural windows, but the size of the thing behind it. Men somewhere in the East who'd never smelled this particular soil, who'd never ridden this fence line or eaten in this kitchen, had decided that this piece of land was theirs to take. They'd put money and time and lawyers and operatives against it, and they'd done it methodically and quietly, and they'd come very close to succeeding without a single moment of open confrontation. That was the part that sat worst with him. Not the aggression. He understood aggression, had handled it his whole life. It was the patience of it, the calculation, the long game played from a great distance by people who would never have to look him in the eye. He turned his horse east as the road curved toward the ranch, and the ridge came into view on the horizon, low and dark against the dimming sky, unremarkable looking as it had always been, keeping its value in the way of things that don't know they have any. He was not going to lose it. Thomas Barker arrived from Denver 12 days later with 2 assistants and equipment that was more precise than anything that had been used on this land in 20 years. He was a heavy-set man in his late 60s who moved slowly and spoke rarely, but carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent his life being precisely right about things. And Bo trusted him on instinct in the same way he'd trusted Evelyn on instinct, something in the quality of their attention to what was in front of them. Barker walked the eastern boundary for 2 days before he touched his instruments. He looked at everything. The existing marker posts from the 1879 survey, the creek bed in its current position, the geological formations that defined the ridge base, the drainage patterns that had shaped the land over 60 years. He took notes in a small leather book and said very little. On the 3rd day, he began the formal survey measurements. Evelyn brought food out to the survey team at midday, a habit she'd quietly established over the course of her time at the ranch, feeding anyone who was working on the property, which the men had noticed and approved of in the uncomplicated way that men approve of being fed. Barker accepted a sandwich and a cup of coffee and looked at her with the alert, assessing eyes of someone who was used to reading landscapes. "You the one who identified the easement clause?" he asked. She looked at him, then at Bo, who was standing nearby. "News travels," Bo said. "Frey told me," Barker said. He took a bite of the sandwich. "Good catch. I've seen that kind of language sink 2 property claims in the past 5 years." He looked at Evelyn directly. "You have legal training?" "No," she said. "Should have," he said, and went back to his sandwich. She didn't respond to that, but Bo saw something briefly in her face. Not pride exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement. The expression of someone who has been told they're capable by a person who would know. The completed survey report was filed with Frey's office in Cheyenne on the 23rd day of the 30-day window. Thomas Barker's measurements placed the Ashford eastern boundary at precisely the same line established by the 1879 Cutler survey. Ridge included, elevation correctly documented at 262 feet above the valley floor, fixed markers established at 12-foot intervals along the contested section. The report included a technical appendix addressing the creek boundary question directly. The 1857 Deeds Creek landmark had been supplemented by the 1879 fixed marker survey, which under territorial law superseded the original landmark description. The documents from Margaret Solis in Rawlins arrived at Frey's office 2 days before the survey. The certified copy of the 1879 contract registry entry, the 1878 reciprocity circular, and a signed affidavit from a retired county official who remembered the reciprocity agreement being distributed and implemented. Frey assembled all of it into a formal response to Meridian's boundary claim and filed it with the territorial court. Gerald Whitmore filed an objection within 4 days. Bo read the objection at the kitchen table with Evelyn beside him. It was a dense document, 12 pages, and it argued that the reciprocity agreement was procedurally invalid, that Barker's survey had used markers whose placement was itself in dispute, and that the 1857 creek boundary remained the operative legal description regardless of subsequent surveys. It cited 4 territorial precedents. 2 of them were real. 2 of them, when Bo tracked down the referenced case numbers through Frey's office, turned out to be slightly misrepresented in their relevance. "He's stalling," Evelyn said, reading over his shoulder. "This is not a brief that expects to win. This is a brief that expects to delay." "Why delay if they can't win the argument?" She straightened, looked at the window. "Because there are other ways to win a property dispute besides the legal argument," she said slowly. "If they can keep this in procedural limbo long enough, the railroad commits to the route," Bo said. "And once the road is committed and the land value becomes publicly known, the pressure on you to sell becomes enormous," she said. "From the court, from the territory, from financial interests you haven't even encountered yet." She turned to look at him. "They don't need to win the case. They need to keep the case alive until the circumstances make winning it unnecessary." He sat with that. "Then we need to close the case before they can stall it that far," he said. "Yes." She folded her arms. "Which means you need the judge to rule on the existing record rather than allowing further pleadings. Which means you need an attorney in Cheyenne. A good one, not the Laramie man, who can file a motion for summary judgment based on the documentation already in front of the court. Do you know what a motion for summary judgment is?" She looked at him with the particular expression she had for questions she considered mildly unnecessary. "I know what I've read," she said, "which isn't the same as knowing the law. You need someone who does. Frey will know who in Cheyenne is good and independent of Meridian." "Then ask him tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." He wrote the letter to Frey that night, after supper, at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and the house quiet and the sound of the wind working along the eaves outside. He wrote clearly and quickly, stating what he needed and why, and when he finished, he folded it and set it ready for the morning rider. Evelyn had stayed up, sitting across the table, going back through the original offer letters and the Whitmore objection with a piece of paper beside her on which she was making notes. He watched her for a moment before he stood to go to bed. The way she worked, head slightly bent, writing in that small, precise hand, moving through the documents with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything she did. He thought about what Barker had said. "You have legal training." Should have. He thought about Clara's letter, the dying wish that had sent this woman to his gate, with a cast iron pan and more attention to detail than most men he'd hired in 6 years combined. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He wasn't sure what he'd meant to say. He stood there for a moment, aware of it, the inadequacy of whatever ordinary words there were for what he actually meant, which was something like, "I don't know what this ranch would look like right now if you hadn't come. I don't know if I'd still have the ridge or the east pasture or any clear view of what was happening to me. I don't know what it means that a stranger standing outside my gate with a heavy pan was the thing standing between me and losing my grandfather's land to people I've never met." "Thank you," he said, which wasn't enough, but it was what he had. She looked at him for a moment, not dismissively, not with any deflection, just looked at him with those steady, direct eyes. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "This isn't finished." She turned back to the documents. He went to bed. She was right. It wasn't finished. The documents were filed and the case was built and the survey was in the record, but Meridian Land Company had capital and patience and a playbook that had likely worked before in other territories against other ranchers who hadn't had someone in their kitchen who knew what to look for. The next move would come. He was sure of it. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about the ridge, and about 45 days that had become 30, and about the particular kind of fight that never announces itself with anything as honest as a punch. Outside, the night sat heavy over the Ashford land, and somewhere in the east, men who'd never been here were deciding what to do next. The next move came not as a legal filing, but as a visitor. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a hired coach, unusual enough on a working ranch road that Dale spotted it a quarter-mile out and came to find Bo in the equipment barn before it reached the gate. The coach was well-maintained, the kind that belonged to money rather than territory, and the man who stepped out of it when it stopped in the yard was dressed accordingly. Wool coat, city boots not suited to the mud, a hat that had never seen wind. He was perhaps 55, with the particular composure of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and being taken seriously. He introduced himself as Edmund Crail. He said he was a representative of Western Capital Partners, and he said it the way a man says something he expects to land with weight. Bo stood in his yard and looked at him. "I know who Western Capital Partners is," he said. "You can get back in your coach." "Mr. Ashford." Crail's voice was measured, practiced, the voice of someone who negotiated for a living and rarely lost. "I've come a long way. I'm asking for 20 minutes. You've been conducting operations against my property for months. You've tampered with my equipment and my fence lines. You filed a fraudulent boundary claim with the territorial court. You don't get 20 minutes. Crail didn't flinch. He clasped his hands in front of him and tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's recalibrating. "I'm not here to defend every decision made on behalf of this enterprise. I'm here because the situation has become more complicated than it needed to be, and because I believe a direct conversation between principals is more productive than a prolonged legal dispute." "I agree," Bo said. "Here's my direct conversation. Get off my property." Crail looked at him for a moment. Then he reached inside his coat and produced an envelope. "The offer inside this envelope is significantly higher than either of the previous two," he said. "It also includes a clause that would allow you to continue operating the cattle portion of your ranch under a long-term lease arrangement. You would retain your home, your livestock operation, and your crew. The only thing that changes hands is the eastern parcel. And the ridge. The ridge is part of the eastern parcel, yes, which is worth more than everything else on this property combined, once the railroad commits to the route." Something moved across Crail's face, not quite surprise, but the controlled response to it. He'd underestimated, apparently, how clearly Bo understood what was at stake. "The railroad route is not confirmed," Crail said. "Not publicly," Bo said. "Take the envelope back with you." Crail stood for another moment. He looked around the yard, at the barn, at the bunkhouse, at the house, with an assessing eye that had nothing of admiration in it. It was the look of someone calculating what a thing costs to maintain and how long a man can sustain that cost under pressure. "The legal process will be expensive," Crail said, "time-consuming, uncertain, regardless of the strength of your documentation. We have the resources to continue this dispute for years if necessary." "Then I guess we'll both be busy," Bo said. Crail held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he put the envelope back inside his coat, turned, and got back in his coach. Bo watched it roll back down the drive until it was out of sight. Then he stood in his yard for another moment, alone in the cold, and felt the full weight of what he'd just done. Turned away enough money to run this ranch for 5 years without strain, from a man who'd made it clear in the polished language of a person who doesn't threaten directly, that the alternative was years of costly legal conflict. Dale came up beside him. "That go the way I thought it went?" "Probably," Bo said. "You all right?" "Ask me in about a year." Dale made a sound that was almost a laugh and walked back toward the barn. Evelyn was at the kitchen window when Bo came inside. She'd seen the coach arrive and had stayed where she was, which he appreciated. She understood that some conversations needed to happen without an audience. He told her who Crail was and what he'd offered and what he'd said about years of legal dispute. She poured him coffee and set it in front of him without being asked. "How long can the ranch carry the cost of a sustained legal fight?" she asked. "Longer than they think," he said. "If I'm careful." He paused. Frey's man in Cheyenne, the attorney, Harlan Webb. He said the motion for summary judgment is strong. Barker's survey, the Rollins documents, the reciprocity agreement. If Judge Cahill rules on the existing record, Meridian loses the boundary claim. "If he rules on the existing record," she said, "Whitmore will keep filing." "Webb is good, better than Whitmore, from what Frey says." She sat down across from him. "Crail coming here himself means something," she said. "Men who operate the way Meridian operates don't send principals to have conversations like this, unless the legal track is looking worse than they expected." He hadn't thought of it that way. He looked at her. "You think we're in a stronger position than they're showing?" "I think Edmund Crail getting on a coach from Cheyenne to stand in your yard and offer you a higher number is not the behavior of a company that believes it's going to win in court." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "It's the behavior of a company that's running out of time." He turned that over. The railroad route, whenever it was publicly announced, the window for quiet acquisition closed. Every week this dispute dragged without resolution was a week closer to that announcement, and once it came, the land value would be established publicly, and the calculation changed for everyone involved. Meridian needed to acquire the ridge before the route was confirmed, because after that, the price would be beyond what any quiet backroom negotiation could manage. "They're on a deadline too," he said. "Yes," she said, "which is why they sent Crail." He looked at his coffee. It was good coffee. She made it properly, something the ranch kitchen had not managed in the years before her. The smallest things. "We hold," he said. "We don't settle. We let Webb do his work and we give Barker's survey time to stand up in court." "And the ranch?" "The ranch keeps running." She nodded. "I'll write to Margaret again. Ask her to check whether Meridian has filed anything similar in other counties. If they've used this approach before, the boundary challenge, the creek landmark argument, there may be a pattern that Webb can use." He looked at her. "You think they've done this elsewhere?" "A company this organized doesn't invent a playbook from scratch," she said. "They've used it before. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but there'll be a record of it somewhere." Bossing. The weeks that followed were the quietest and the hardest simultaneously, which is a particular kind of difficult that people who haven't lived it don't always understand. The legal machinery was moving, Webb was filing, Frey was coordinating, Barker had submitted a supplemental technical statement addressing Whitmore's objections to the survey markers. But from the ranch, none of that was visible. What was visible was work. The daily, seasonal, unrelenting work of a cattle operation in winter, feeding, fence maintenance, water management, equipment upkeep, that continued regardless of what was happening in a Cheyenne courtroom. Bo threw himself into it, with the particular focus of a man who needs his body to be doing something while his mind is somewhere he can't reach. He was out before light every morning, working alongside his crew instead of directing from a distance the way he sometimes had in the past, and the men responded to that without acknowledging it, just worked harder themselves, pulled together in the way that people do when they feel the shape of what's at stake, even if no one has said it directly. He'd told them. Not everything, not the legal details, but enough. He'd gathered the crew one evening after supper and told them about the boundary dispute, about Meridian, about the ridge, and what it meant. He'd told them straight, without managing the news or softening it. because these were men who'd given their work to this ranch and they deserved to know what they were working on. The room had been quiet when he finished. Then Red Hargrave, who was not a man given to speeches, had said, "So what do you need from us?" And that had been essentially the whole of it. Not a rally, not a moment, just a practical question from a practical man, which was worth more than any rousing answer Bo could have given. "Same as always," Bo had said. "Show up and do the work." Tommy Fitch had looked around the table and then looked at Bo and said, "We're not going anywhere," in the slightly embarrassed tone of someone who means something sincerely and isn't sure where to put it. A couple of the other men had nodded. That was the end of the meeting. What happened after it was harder to name. The crew didn't change dramatically. They were working men doing their jobs, same as always. But there was a quality to the way they did those jobs in the following weeks, a steadiness with a slight edge to it, like the difference between doing something because it's your duty and doing it because you've decided it matters. He noticed it. He thought Evelyn noticed it too, though she said nothing. She was managing her own version of the same sustained pressure. The letter to Margaret Solis in Rollins had produced results. Margaret's husband, the county courthouse clerk, had connections across 3 counties and had made some quiet inquiries. What came back was a pattern. Meridian, or its predecessor entity under a slightly different name, had filed boundary challenges against 2 other ranches in the territory over the past 4 years. One challenge had resulted in a settlement. The rancher had sold under financial pressure after the dispute dragged into its 2nd year. The second challenge had been withdrawn when the rancher died, and the estate went to a nephew in Ohio who liquidated the whole property anyway. Neither case had gone to a full court ruling on the merits, which meant, as Webb confirmed when Bo forwarded the information, that Meridian had never actually had their boundary argument tested in front of a judge. "They've never had to win in court," Webb wrote back. "They've always won before court. Your case may be the first time they have to actually defend the legal argument, and from what I can see of the argument, it doesn't hold." That was, quietly, the best news Bo had received in months. He told Evelyn over supper, alone in the kitchen after the men had gone. She read Webb's letter and set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Don't relax," she said. "I know. A company that's never had to win in court is a company that has other options they haven't used yet." She looked at the letter again. Edmund Crail coming here was one thing. If the legal track continues to go badly for them, the next thing may not be a visit with an envelope. He looked at her. "You think they'd move past property sabotage?" "I think men who've spent significant capital on an acquisition that's slipping away from them sometimes make decisions that weren't in the original plan," she said carefully. "I'm not predicting anything. I'm saying don't relax." He nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing in a less articulated way for days. A low-grade alertness that he hadn't been able to fully account for until she'd named it. "I'm going to talk to the neighboring ranchers," he said. "Dalton Pierce over at the Rocking P and the Harmon brothers east of the county line. They should know what's happening. If Meridian is running this play against me, there's nothing stopping them from running it against someone else as soon as they give up on the Ashford land." "That's a good idea," she said. "And if Pierce and the Harmons are aware and watching, it makes this ranch harder to approach unobserved." "Neighbors watching neighbors," he said. "It's how it's supposed to work," she said, "before money gets big enough to make people think they can operate without anyone noticing." So he rode out to Dalton Pierce's ranch on a Saturday, alone, the way he'd always ridden when the errand was one that needed to arrive without the implication of force. Pierce was a decade older than Bo and had been his father's contemporary rather than his own, but there was a straightforward mutual respect between them built on shared fence lines and fair dealing, and the particular bond of men who've run livestock through the same hard winters. Pierce listened to everything Bo told him, sitting on the porch of his house, with his coat on and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, the way a man sits when he's giving a thing his full attention. When Bo finished, Pierce said, "I had a man approach me in October, said he was a buyer from Cheyenne, interested in my south pasture." Bo went still. "Did he say who he represented?" "Said he was independent. I told him I wasn't selling, and he went away." Pierce looked at his coffee. "But he'd done his homework. Knew the acreage, knew what I ran on it, knew the water access from the creek. You don't know those things unless you've had someone looking at my land before you show up to ask about it." "Meridian," Bo said. "Probably." Pierce looked at him. "They're mapping the whole corridor, aren't they? Not just your ridge, the whole approach to wherever that railroad is coming through." That's what I think. Pierce was quiet for a moment. The Harmon brothers had trouble with their east fence last month. Thought it was cattle from the Morton place getting through. But the Morton place doesn't run stock on that side anymore. He turned to look at Bo directly. I'll talk to the Harmons. And I've got two other neighbors I trust. We put eyes on the ridgeline and the eastern roads. We'll know when anyone's moving through that corridor that doesn't belong. I'm not asking you to take on my fight, Bo said. You're not asking me anything, Pierce said. I'm deciding on my own that I don't want what happened to your property happening to mine. He stood and picked up his cold coffee. Come inside. Tell me exactly what documentation you have and what you still need. They sat at Pierce's kitchen table for 2 hours. The conversation moved from legal specifics to practical security to the broader question of what the railroad announcement would mean for land values across the whole region. And by the time Bo rode home in the early afternoon, he felt something that he hadn't let himself feel in months, that he was not doing this entirely alone. It was a strange feeling. He'd organized himself against it for so long that its arrival was almost uncomfortable, the way warmth feels uncomfortable to hands that have been cold too long. He told Evelyn about Pierce that evening. She was at the stove, and he sat at the table and talked while she worked, which had become the natural rhythm of their evenings, the way they'd arrived at talking seriously about things without planning to. She listened and then said, Good. Pierce is exactly the kind of neighbor who can make this harder for Meridian to manage quietly. He might be in their sights too, Bo said. Then he's better off knowing. She turned to check something in the oven. Did you tell him about Crail's visit? Yes. What did he say? He said a man in city boots who takes a hired coach onto a working ranch road doesn't understand what he's dealing with. Bo paused. I think that's Pierce's version of encouragement. Something crossed Evelyn's face. That near smile, the one that arrived sometimes without her intending it. Then it went away, and she turned back to what she was doing, and the kitchen was quiet for a bit. It was the silence sometimes that said the most. Not in a literary way, not in the way people talk about comfortable silence as if it's a destination. More in the practical sense that two people who are being honest with each other don't always need to be talking. The talking and the quiet had the same quality now. Both felt like the same conversation continuing. He became aware, sitting at that table in that kitchen, that something had shifted in the construction of his days without his having made a decision about it. Evelyn was part of how the ranch worked now, not in the hired help sense, not as a function, but as a presence with weight and perspective and a specific kind of authority that had nothing to do with title and everything to do with what she'd actually done here. He didn't know how to categorize that, and he'd stopped trying to, which was itself a change from his usual nature. Can I ask you something? He said. She glanced over her shoulder. You can ask? Why did you keep running? She turned from the stove, not with any alarm, just turned to face him. What do you mean? Before Clearwater, Kansas, and other places before that. He kept his voice level, not accusing, not probing, just asking, the way you ask someone something when you actually want to know and you're willing to hear whatever the answer is. You said your family was gone. The farm was gone. But a woman with your abilities, your attention, the way you read situations, you didn't have to be moving through boarding houses. You could have built something stable anywhere. She was quiet for a moment. She turned and leaned against the counter, arms folded, looking at him with the thoughtful expression of someone who's been asked a fair question and is deciding to give it a fair answer. After the farm went under, I felt like I'd failed at the one thing I was supposed to do, she said. Stay. Make something of the place my parents had built. I was the oldest, and there were 2 younger sisters, and we scattered. She paused. I couldn't fix what happened, so I just moved. Told myself I was looking for something better. But I think, if I'm honest about it, I was mostly making sure that nothing was ever solid enough under my feet, that losing it would feel the way losing the farm felt. He said nothing. Claire used to tell me I was the most capable homeless person she'd ever met, she said. The memory moved across her face, not with grief exactly, but with the weight of missing someone. She meant it kindly. She thought I was wasting myself. She was right, he said. Evelyn looked at him. A real look, direct and unguarded for a moment. She sent me here because she knew this was a place that needed someone like me, Evelyn said. And because she thought I needed a place like this. A pause. I've been trying to decide whether she was right about that second part. And? She unfolded her arms. I'm still deciding, she said, and turned back to the stove. He sat with that. He understood the rhythm of it, the way she gave something real and then moved on. Not as avoidance, but as the natural forward motion of a person who doesn't perform their inner life. He respected it. It matched, in some ways, the way he operated himself, or the way he'd always told himself he operated. I owe you something, he said. Beyond wages. She didn't turn around. You don't owe me anything. Evelyn. She stopped what she was doing but didn't turn. When my father died, he said, I was 28 years old and I'd been working this land my whole life, and I still didn't know if I was capable of running it the way it needed to be run. I'd spent 6 years trying to prove I was, and I hadn't. I hadn't let anyone close enough to see whether I was or not, because if they saw it and the answer was no, then there was nothing left. He stopped. Let the sentence sit without finishing it more neatly than it deserved. She'd turned. She was looking at him. Clara knew, he said. She never said it to my face, but she knew what I was doing, and she knew I couldn't fix it myself, because the problem with that particular kind of being alone is that you can't solve it alone. He looked at the table. I think that's why she sent you. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. She said you were worth the trouble, she said finally. Clara. She said that specifically. She said most people weren't, but you were. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did nothing, just let it sit in the kitchen between them. After a moment, she turned back to the stove. Supper's in 10 minutes, she said. All right, he said. Oh, the motion for summary judgment was argued before Judge Warren Cahill in Cheyenne 17 days later. Beau attended. He'd ridden to Cheyenne the day before and sat in Harlan Webb's office for 3 hours going through the argument and the expected objections. Webb was a lean, sharp-eyed man in his early 40s who had the particular quality of good attorneys. He spoke carefully and meant every word, with no ornamentation and no wasted sentences. He'd been doing this for 15 years, and he could read a judge the way Evelyn read a contract. Not what it said on the surface, but what it was designed to accomplish. Cahill will give Whitmore room to argue, Webb said. He doesn't like summary rulings on property disputes. He'll want to feel like he's given both sides adequate hearing. He folded his hands on the desk. But the record is what it is. The Rollins documents answer the Cutler question. Barker's survey answers the boundary question. The only thing Whitmore has left is procedural objection, and Cahill has limited patience for that when the underlying facts are clear. How limited? Beau asked. Limited enough, Webb said. I think was not a guarantee. Beau understood that. Nothing in law was a guarantee. But it was an honest assessment from a man who didn't offer false comfort, and he'd take honest over comfortable. The hearing itself was in a second-floor courtroom that smelled of old wood and coal heat, and the accumulated paper of a decade's worth of territorial disputes. Whitmore was there with 2 assistants, which was more than he'd brought to any previous filing, and Crail was in the gallery, not at the table, just present, watching from 3 rows back with the composed attention of someone who owned a stake in the outcome. Beau sat behind Webb and watched the judge. Cahill was in his mid-60s, heavy-set, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on as he reviewed documents. He asked both sides questions throughout rather than simply listening, which was Webb's read of him. A judge who formed his view during argument rather than after it. He pushed back on Whitmore twice on the reciprocity agreement, asking for the specific case law supporting the challenge to its validity. And when Whitmore cited a precedent, Cahill looked it up himself and asked a follow-up question that made clear he'd read it more carefully than Whitmore had hoped. He pushed back on Webb once, on a technical question about the survey methodology, and Webb answered it without hesitation and with enough precision that Cahill wrote something down, which Webb had told Beau was a good sign. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Cahill said he would issue a ruling within 2 weeks and dismissed both parties. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway, Beau passed within 5 feet of Edmund Crail. The man looked at him, not with hostility, not with defeat, just with the measured assessment of someone who was still calculating. Beau looked back at him without stopping. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in the yard of his ranch 3 weeks ago. He rode home the next morning. Evelyn was in the kitchen when he arrived, and the crew was at work in the yard. and the ridge sat on the eastern horizon exactly as it always had. He unsaddled his horse and told Dale briefly how the hearing had gone, and Dale said, "Good," in the particular flat way he had when he meant it completely. At supper that evening, he told the crew, not the legal details, just that the hearing had gone as well as it could, and now they waited. Red Hargrave raised his coffee cup slightly, which was the closest thing to a toast Red ever produced. Tommy Fitch looked like he might say something and then didn't, which was probably wise. Later, alone in the kitchen with Evelyn after the men had gone, he sat at the table and felt the exhaustion of the past month settling into his bones all at once. The particular heaviness that arrives when you've been holding something at tension and you let yourself, just briefly, set it down. "You should sleep," she said. "In a minute." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I keep thinking about what Crail said, that it would be expensive and uncertain. Years. He was trying to break your resolution," she said. "I know, but he wasn't wrong that it's expensive." He paused. "The ranch can carry it. I wasn't lying when I told Dale we'd manage. But it's not nothing, Evelyn. This has cost things." "Most things worth keeping cost something," she said. He looked at her. "That's true. And it's also slightly convenient when you're the one saying it." She looked back at him with a flicker of that near smile. "I know. I'm saying it anyway." He leaned back in his chair. The kitchen was warm, and the lamp was low, and outside the windows, the March dark sat over the land without any visible feature to distinguish it from any other March dark in any other year. But it was different somehow from the way it had looked on those early mornings before she'd come. The kitchen dark and cold, the coffee bitter, the day ahead as gray as the one before it. "Whatever Cahill decides," Bo said, "I need you to know that this ranch is better than it was before you came. Not because of the legal work, or the supply costs, or the kitchen." He looked at her. "Because of what you did to the people in it." She was quiet. "Tommy Fitch is a different person than he was in November," he said. "Dale talks at supper. Red laughed at something last week. Actually laughed. Not the thing he does where he exhales more forcefully than usual." He paused. "Those aren't small things. I didn't do them. You did." She looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her expression was different. Not her usual composed steadiness, but something beneath it. Something that hadn't been covered over quite in time. "I didn't do it to prove anything," she said. "I know. I just fed people. Paid attention." She shook her head slightly, dismissing her own words. "It's not complicated." "The things that aren't complicated are usually the ones that matter most," he said, "and they're usually the ones that are hardest to keep doing." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved along the house the way it always did, finding its habitual path along the north wall, the same sound it made in October and January, and now March. "Bo?" she said, and then she stopped. "What?" She shook her head. Not dismissive, more like she'd reached the edge of something and was looking at it, deciding whether to step. "I'm trying to figure out if I'm staying because this is where I should be," she said, "or because it's the first place in years that's felt like I should be somewhere." He didn't rush to answer. "Is there a difference?" She thought about that. "Maybe not," she admitted. "Clara thought you needed a place," he said. "That's what you told me. Clara was usually right about things." "Then trust her on this one." He stood from the chair and she looked up at him. "You don't have to decide everything tonight," he said. "The court will rule when it rules. The ranch is still here." He picked up his coffee cup and took it to the basin. "Get some sleep, Evelyn." She was quiet. He set the cup down and started toward the door. "Bo?" He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for saying what you said about the people in the ranch." He stood with his back to her for a moment. "I should have said it sooner," he said, and went upstairs. The ruling came on a Wednesday, 14 days after the hearing, delivered by express to Webb's office in Cheyenne, and forwarded immediately to the Ashford Ranch by the fastest rider Webb could arrange. Bo was in the east pasture when Tommy Fitch came out to find him at a dead run, which told him the news before Tommy's face did. He pulled his horse up and Tommy arrived out of breath, holding the letter out with both hands, and Bo took it and read it there in the field with the ridge on the horizon, and the late afternoon light going flat and gold across the grass. Judge Warren Cahill had ruled in favor of the Ashford boundary, as established by the 1879 survey. He had found Meridian's Cutler challenge without legal merit given the reciprocity agreement evidence, and the contract registry documentation from Rawlins. He had dismissed the creek boundary argument on the grounds that the 1879 survey's fixed markers superseded the original deed's landmark description under established territorial property law. The preliminary boundary claim filed by Meridian Land Company was formally rejected and expunged from the territorial record. The ridge was Ashford land, had been, and would remain. Bo read the ruling twice. Then he folded it and put it inside his coat. He looked at Tommy Fitch, who was watching him with the expression of someone who'd run that far and was now uncertain what the appropriate response to being that out of breath should be. "Go tell Dale," Bo said. "Tell the rest of the crew at supper." "What about you?" Tommy asked. Bo turned his horse toward the east. "I'm going to ride the fence line," he said. Tommy opened his mouth, closed it, and nodded. He turned and ran back toward the house. Bo rode east alone. He followed the fence line that ran parallel to the ridge, the line that marked where his grandfather's land ended and the open territory began, the line that someone had tried to move through patient legal engineering and nighttime operations and pressure applied from a great distance. He rode it slowly, not checking it exactly, just riding it. The fence posts stood the same as always, some new from the repairs, some older, weathered and gray, holding the wire at exactly the tension it needed. The ridge rose on his right as he rode, and he looked at it. Really looked at it, the way you look at something when you've almost lost it and then haven't. It wasn't beautiful. That was always the truth of it. It was just rock and scrub brush and the right elevation, nothing that would make a man stop in his tracks on an ordinary day. His grandfather had fenced it because it was the edge of his land, and his father had surveyed it because a surveyor needed a boundary. And Bo had ridden past it his whole life without understanding that it was the thing everything was ultimately about. He understood that now. Not just the railroad value, not just the money. The principle underneath all of it, that the land belonged to the person who'd built their life on it and defended it and refused to be maneuvered away from it, regardless of how sophisticated the maneuvering was or how much capital was behind it. He rode the full eastern fence line in the fading afternoon and came back as the dark was settling in, and the lights of the ranch house were visible from a long way out, warm and steady in the dark, the way they'd been every night since Evelyn had started getting up before dawn to build the fire in the kitchen stove. He rode in and put his horse up and walked to the house. He could hear voices from the dining room as he crossed the yard, the crew at supper, louder than usual, and somewhere in the sound of it, laughter, real laughter, the kind that doesn't need a reason to be more than itself. He stood outside the back door for a moment before he went in, listening to that sound. Then he pushed the door open and went into the warm kitchen, and Evelyn turned from the stove and looked at him, and he pulled the ruling from inside his coat and held it out to her. She took it, read it, stood there with the paper in both hands while the sounds of the crew came through the wall. Then she set it on the counter and turned back to the stove, and her hands were steady when she picked up the spoon, but he could see from where he stood that they had taken a moment to be steady. "Supper's ready," she said. "I know," he said. He washed his hands at the basin and then walked through to the dining room, where 12 men were sitting around the table in various states of celebration that looked, from the outside, remarkably like a normal supper on a normal evening, except that everyone was a little louder, and Tommy Fitch was grinning at nothing in particular, and Dale Pruitt was sitting at the table with his coat off, which meant he intended to stay a while. Bo sat at the head of the table. Evelyn came through from the kitchen with the pot, and she moved around the table filling plates, and when she passed behind Bo, she set her hand briefly on his shoulder, just for a moment, not saying anything, just that, and then moved on. He looked at his plate. Around him the crew ate and talked and made the noise of people who were somewhere they intended to be, and the ridge sat outside in the dark, exactly where it had always been, exactly where it would remain. Meridian Land Company did not go quietly. That would have been too simple, and nothing about this had been simple from the beginning. Gerald Whitmore filed an appeal with the territorial court within 10 days of Cahill's ruling. Webb had expected it. He'd told Bo as much in the letter that accompanied the ruling, and he was ready for it. The appeal cited procedural grounds rather than factual ones, which was the tell. When a legal argument retreats from the substance of a case to the procedure around it, it means the substance is gone. Whitmore was buying time, the same move Evelyn had identified weeks before the ruling even came down. But buying time costs money, And somewhere behind Meridian and Western Capital Partners and the careful architecture of shell companies, a calculation was being made about whether the cost was still worth it. That calculation took 3 weeks to resolve itself. The answer came not through the court, but through Aldous Frey, who wrote to Bo on a Thursday afternoon with a message that was brief and characteristically direct. Whitmore had withdrawn the appeal. Meridian's boundary claim was formally closed. The territorial record was clear. It was over. Bo read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in late April, with the windows showing the first real green of the season pushing up through the pasture grass and the sound of the crew working in the yard carrying through the walls. He read it once and set it down and sat for a while without doing anything. Evelyn came in from the pantry carrying a sack of flour and set it on the counter and looked at him. She read his expression the way she'd learned to read it over these months. Not the surface of it, but the thing underneath. "It's done," he said. She set down the flour. She came to the table and he handed her the letter and she read it standing, and when she finished, she set it on the table in front of him and stood there for a moment without speaking. "Whitmore withdrew," she said. "Yes." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Outside, someone, Tommy, from the sound of it, was moving something heavy across the yard, and there was the particular percussion of spring work beginning, the ranch shifting gears from the contained survival mode of winter into the expansive labor of the warmer months. "Why now?" she asked, not doubting it, just wanting to understand the shape of it completely. "Frey thinks the railroad route announcement is coming soon," Bo said. "Once it's public, the acquisition opportunity closes permanently. There's no point continuing a legal fight for land they can no longer acquire quietly once the value is established on the open market." She nodded slowly. "They cut their losses." "Men like Crail know when to stop," he said. "That's actually what makes them dangerous. They're not reckless. They go until the math changes, and then they stop." She was quiet for a moment. "Does that bother you, that they just stop and move on to the next thing?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "A little. Because there's no accounting for what they did here. The fence lines, cleat, the equipment, the time, and the legal costs. They did all of that, and they just walk away. And somewhere else, there's another piece of land and another rancher who doesn't know what's coming." She looked at him. "Then do something about that part." "What do you mean?" "Webb has the full record of what Meridian did here. The tactics, the false affidavit on the Cutler license, the sabotage that you documented. Frey has the territorial filing history." She folded her hands on the table. "Write it up. Send it to the territorial governor's office and to the land office and to every county recorder in Carbon County and the counties around it. Not as a complaint, as a record, as a document that says, here is how this was done, here is what to look for, here is what happened when someone looked carefully." "What?" He looked at her. "They count on the fact that their targets don't talk to each other," she said. "Pierce didn't know about your situation until you rode over there. You didn't know about the 2 previous ranches until Margaret dug it up. If there's a clear record that circulates that ranchers and county officials can read and recognize, the next time Meridian or something like Meridian tries this approach, it won't be as invisible." He sat with that. It was like most of what she suggested, simple in principle and significant in practice. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way that confrontation was satisfying, but more durable than confrontation by a considerable margin. "I'll write it with Webb," he said. "He'll know how to make it useful legally." "Good," she said. He looked at the letter from Frey still sitting on the table between them. He thought about the months between the moment he'd unlatched the gate and let her through and this moment, sitting in this kitchen with spring outside the window and the crew at work and the ridge still on his land. He thought about what it had cost. The money was real. The legal hours were real. Cleet's betrayal had left a mark that didn't fade just because it was resolved. And he thought about what had been built alongside those costs, which was harder to name but no less real. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She waited. "The ranch," he said. "I've been thinking about how it's run, about what it needs going forward." He paused, finding the words for something he'd been turning over for weeks without quite articulating it. "The legal fight showed me something I should have already known, that I was managing this place as if one person's judgment was enough. My father ran it that way. and I learned it from him. And it mostly worked, except for the places where it didn't, which were the places that nearly cost me everything. She was watching him carefully. I want to make you a formal partner in this ranch, he said. Not an employee, not a housekeeper with influence over the kitchen decisions. He held her gaze. An equal partner in the operation. Half the decisions, half the accountability, half the risk. He paused. And half of whatever it becomes. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Tommy had apparently resolved whatever he was moving because the yard had gone to the normal working sounds of mid-morning. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Not the specific expression on her face, which wasn't surprised exactly, but was something past the composed steadiness she usually wore, something more unguarded. That's a significant offer, she said. It's a fair one, he said. You saved this land. Not by yourself. The whole crew held, and Pierce and Webb and Frey all did their part. But the strategy, the documents, the Rollins connection, the easement clause, without those things, I signed that second offer letter, and I don't know what I've signed until it's too late. He kept his voice level. I know what this ranch is worth. I know what you contributed to it being worth that. A salary doesn't account for that. She looked at the table. He watched her face moving through something internal that she wasn't narrating. I'm not a rancher, she said. I know kitchens and supply chains and how to read a contract. I don't know cattle. I know cattle, he said. That's not what's been missing. She looked up. What's been missing, he said carefully, is someone who pays attention to the whole of it. Not just the livestock or the fence lines or the legal documents separately. The whole picture at once. He paused. That's what you do. I've watched you do it for 5 months. She was quiet for a while. He didn't fill the silence. He'd learned from watching her that some silences were working silences and interrupting them was a kind of disrespect. I'd want it in writing, she said finally. Properly drawn up, not a handshake. I'll have Webb draft it. And I'd want to understand the full financial position of the ranch before I sign anything. Books, outstanding debts, the legal costs from the past months. I'll open every ledger I have. She nodded once, slowly, still looking at the table. Then she looked up at him. Why? She said. Not suspicious, genuinely asking. You could hire a good manager, someone with ranching experience, someone who knows the cattle business end to end. That would solve the operational problem more efficiently than this. He looked at her directly. Because a manager does a job, he said. A partner has a stake. He paused. I've had employees. I've had people who worked here well and honestly, and I valued every one of them. But what I was missing, what this ranch was missing, wasn't competence. It was someone who would look at a problem and think, this is mine to solve. Not because they're paid to, but because the outcome matters to them personally. She held his gaze. Does the outcome matter to you personally? He asked. Be honest. A long moment. Yes, she said, simply, without decoration. Then we have an agreement in principle, he said. Webb can handle the paperwork. She exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, but it was a real breath, the kind you let out when you've been holding something. All right, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup, which had gone cold, and drank the rest of it anyway. She stood from the table and went back to the flowers she'd set on the counter before all of this had started, and the kitchen returned to its ordinary sounds and rhythms, and it felt, in the most grounded and unspectacular way, like the right thing had just happened. Dalton Pierce came over the following Saturday with the Harmon brothers, ostensibly to discuss the spring grazing arrangements along the shared fence line. But actually, as was immediately apparent when they arrived with their wives and Pierce's 2 youngest children in tow, to mark what had happened in the way that neighboring ranchers mark things, not with speeches or ceremonies, but with a shared meal and a longer evening than the stated purpose required. Evelyn had known they were coming because Beau had told her, and she'd spent most of Saturday morning in a state of focused kitchen activity that she didn't ask for help with, and the men knew better than to offer. By the time the Pierce wagon rolled into the yard at midday, the house smelled of the kind of cooking that makes people walk toward a kitchen even when they didn't intend to. Pierce's wife, a compact and observant woman named Helen, found her way to the kitchen within 10 minutes of arriving, and introduced herself with the directness of someone who doesn't believe in preamble. "You're Evelyn Cross," she said. "Dalton told me about you. He said you were either very capable or very lucky, and he couldn't decide which." "Both, probably," Evelyn said. Helen Pierce looked around the kitchen with the practiced eye of a woman who ran her own household and knew what organization cost in time and effort, and she said, "What do you need me to do?" Which was the beginning of what turned out to be an afternoon that Evelyn would remember not for any particular moment in it, but for the quality of it. The easy movement of people who didn't know each other well but were willing to. The children running through the yard while the men looked at fence maps and argued about water rights with the mild heat of people who are actually comfortable with each other. The table at dinner crowded in a way the Ashford Ranch table had not been crowded since before Beau's father died. Tommy Fitch spent most of dinner talking to Pierce's eldest son, who was 17 and apparently shared with Tommy a total ignorance of what he wanted to do with his life, which gave them plenty to discuss. Dale Pruitt sat next to old Harmon, the elder of the two brothers, and found out within 20 minutes that Harmon had grown up on land adjacent to a ranch where Dale had worked at 18. And the conversation that resulted from that discovery lasted through dessert and most of the clearing up. Beau watched all of it from the head of the table and felt something he didn't have a practiced name for, because the name for it was simply this. This was what the ranch was supposed to feel like. Not the legal victory, not the security of the boundary ruling, not the financial strength of holding on to the eastern parcel. This, the noise of people at a table who are genuinely somewhere they want to be. His father had built this ranch as a place for a family, not just an operation. Beau had run it as an operation for 6 years because that was what the circumstances required, and because he hadn't known how to do otherwise. He understood now that the operation and the family were not separate things to be managed in sequence, but the same thing, requiring the same attention simultaneously, and that you couldn't let one go hollow in service of the other without losing something essential from both. After dinner, while Helen Pierce and Evelyn washed dishes and the men moved to the front porch with their coffee, Pierce leaned against the porch rail and looked at Beau with the expression of someone who's been holding a thought long enough that it's ready to come out. "That woman," he said. "Evelyn." Beau looked at him. "She staying?" Pierce asked. "Yes." Pierce nodded, satisfied in the way of a man who'd already decided the answer before asking the question. "Good," he said. "This ranch looks different than it did last year." "I know." "I don't mean the legal business. I mean," Pierce gestured vaguely at the house, the yard, the lit windows. "The feel of it, the way your men are." He picked up his coffee. "A ranch is just land and livestock without that. Any fool with enough money can buy land and livestock." "I know that too," Beau said. "I'm learning it later than I should have." Pierce made a sound of mild disagreement. "You learned it when you needed to, same as everybody." They drank their coffee and looked out at the dark yard, and the sounds of the house came through the walls. Helen Pierce's laugh, lower pitched and drier than Evelyn's rare one, and the clatter of dishes, and somewhere in the back of the house the children. "The railroad announcement," Pierce said, "should be public within a month, from what I'm hearing." Frey thinks the same. "When it comes, there'll be other buyers, legitimate ones, not Meridian, people who want to negotiate properly for access or development rights." "I know." "You thought about what you want to do with the ridge?" Beau had thought about it considerably. "Talk to Evelyn first," he said. "Then decide." Pierce looked at him sideways, not with surprise, but with the slight recalibration of a man updating his understanding of a situation. "Partnership?" he asked. "Formal," Beau said. "Webb's drafting it." Pierce was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, deliberately. "Smart," he said, which was Pierce's version of a strong endorsement. The partnership documents were signed on a Tuesday in the second week of May, in Webb's office in Cheyenne, with Frey as a witness because Beau trusted him, and because it seemed fitting that the man who'd helped protect the property should be present when its future was being formally arranged. Evelyn had spent the previous week going through every ledger Beau owned, which he'd laid out for her without reservation. 6 years of accounts, the legal costs of the boundary dispute, the outstanding supplier agreements, the current cattle valuation, and projected seasonal income. She'd sat with those books for 3 evenings and asked Beau questions each morning that were specific and sometimes uncomfortable, and he'd answered all of them as completely as he could, And on the fourth evening, she'd told him she was satisfied with the financial picture and ready to sign. Webb had drawn up the agreement with the thoroughness that characterized everything he did. It established equal partnership in the Ashford Ranch operations, divided decision-making authority along clear lines. Cattle and land management decisions required mutual agreement on anything above a set threshold. Day-to-day operations each partner could manage independently, and included provisions for how the partnership would handle the eventual railroad negotiations when they came. Evelyn read every line of it. Webb watched her do it with professional respect and said nothing. Frey, sitting to the side, had the expression of a man who'd spent his career watching people not read things carefully enough and found this particular scene quietly satisfying. She signed it in a clear, composed hand. Bo signed below her. Webb shook both their hands. Frey shook both their hands. Outside Webb's window, Cheyenne went on making its noise of construction and commerce, and the general forward motion of a place where money was arriving faster than the buildings could contain it. They rode back to the ranch side by side in the afternoon, not talking much, which was fine. There are things that don't need to be talked about immediately, that need a little time to simply exist before the words arrive for them. About halfway home, with the land opening up around them into the wide, rolling country that ran between Cheyenne and the ranch, Evelyn said, without particular preamble, "My younger sister lives in Nebraska. We haven't spoken in 4 years." He glanced at her. "I'm going to write to her," she said. "I've been putting it off because I didn't know where I was writing from. What address to give her?" She looked at the road ahead. "Now I know." He didn't say anything to that. He didn't think it needed a response. He understood the shape of what she was saying, the way a place becomes real when you decide it's yours, the way belonging somewhere makes it possible to reach back toward the things you left behind when you were moving, because you no longer need the moving to define you. They rode on. The railroad announcement came 18 days later, not in any dramatic fashion, just a printed notice in the territorial paper and a formal statement from the railroad company identifying the confirmed route through Carbon County. The route ran approximately where the survey teams had indicated, and the nearest approach point to the Ashford property was the Eastern Ridge section, exactly as Frey had predicted and Meridian had calculated. Within a week, Bo received 3 letters of inquiry from legitimate interests, 2 from railroad-affiliated land agents and 1 from a private investment group in Denver, all asking about the possibility of negotiating access rights or a partial lease arrangement for the Ridge section. He and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table that evening with all 3 letters arranged in front of them, which was now the standard way significant correspondence was handled on the Ashford Ranch. Reviewed together, decided together. "None of these are offers to buy," she said. "No. Access rights and lease arrangements only, which is what I'd prefer." He'd thought about this in the weeks since Pierce had raised it on the porch. "I don't want to sell the Ridge. I want to keep the land whole. But the railroad needs to run. And if there's a way to negotiate access that doesn't compromise our operation and generates income, then it becomes an asset instead of just a liability we had to defend," she said. "Yes." She looked at the 3 letters. The Denver group's letter is the most professionally written, but the railroad's own inquiry is the most direct, and we have less exposure dealing with the principal than with an intermediary. "That's what I thought, too." She looked at him. "We should ask Frey to recommend a railroad law specialist for the negotiations. Webb is good, but this is a different kind of transaction." "I was going to say the same thing." She nodded and began making notes on the paper beside her. He watched her write, the small, precise hand moving quickly, and thought about Crail standing in the yard in his city boots, offering a number that was designed to feel large enough to be difficult to refuse. He thought about the moment he'd handed the letter back and watched the coach roll back down the drive. He hadn't known then exactly what he was choosing by refusing it, beyond the refusal itself. Now he understood it more completely. He'd been choosing this. The table, the letters, the decision made together rather than alone. The ranch made its sounds around them, the house settling in the spring evening, the distant movement of the crew doing final checks before dark, the wind along the north wall that he'd been listening to his whole life. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up from her notes. He'd been carrying something for a while that he hadn't found the right moment for, in the way that the things that matter most are often the hardest to simply say. He was a man who'd been built for action and work and the practical management of difficult things, and what he was feeling was none of those. It was something quieter and more certain than any of them, and it required words that didn't come with the same ease as a decision about fence posts or legal filings. "I know what we signed in Cheyenne is a business arrangement, Shen," he said. "A legal document, and I'm not asking you to hear this as anything other than what it is, which is me telling you something true." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know exactly when it happened, somewhere between the gate and the kitchen and the letters and the east fence line at night. But what I feel about you being here is not what I feel about a partnership. It's something more than that, and I think you probably know it, and I wanted to say it plainly instead of letting it sit unsaid because I was too careful to be honest about it." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn set down her pen. She looked at him, the same direct, unguarded look she'd given him in the kitchen months ago, the one that was underneath her usual composure rather than instead of it. "I know," she said. "That's all?" "No," she said. "That's not all." She folded her hands on the table. "I came here because Clara asked me to. I stayed the first week because the ranch needed it, and because I wanted to see if I could do something useful here. I signed the partnership papers because the arrangement is fair, and I believe in the ranch and its future." She paused. "None of those things are why I'm still here." He waited. "I'm still here because this is the first place I've been in years where I'm not waiting to leave," she said. "And because you are the most honest, difficult person I have ever met, and I mean both of those things as a compliment." The corner of her mouth moved, not the near smile this time, but the actual thing, brief and real. "And because the crew would fall apart in a week if I left, and I've gotten attached to Tommy Fitch's appetite and Dale Pruitt's whole personality, and Red Hargrave finally laughed at something last month, and I would like to see that happen again." Skid. He looked at her for a moment. "That's a complicated answer. You asked a complicated thing." "I suppose I did." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going anywhere, Beau," she said. "That's the simple version." He nodded. He looked at the letters on the table and at her notes beside them, and at the lamp between them throwing its circle of light across the wood, and outside the windows the spring dark over the Ashford land, over all of it, the pastures and the fence lines and the bunkhouse where his crew was settling in for the night, and the East Ridge sitting on the horizon the way it always had. Patient and enduring and worth exactly what it had always been worth, whether anyone knew it or not. "We should write to Frey tomorrow," he said. "About the railroad negotiations." "First thing," she agreed, and picked up her pen. "Das." What happened after that was not a story with sharp edges. Life on the Ashford Ranch in the months that followed Cahill's ruling and the partnership signing was the kind of life that doesn't make for a dramatic telling because it was built from ordinary things done consistently and well. The spring calving came, and the crew managed it with the particular focused exhaustion that calving season always required. The railroad access negotiations moved slowly, as all negotiations do when lawyers are involved on multiple sides, and eventually produced an agreement that gave the railroad the access rights they needed, and the Ashford Ranch a reliable annual income from the arrangement that changed the financial picture of the operation considerably. Evelyn wrote to her sister in Nebraska. The first reply took 2 weeks and was cautious, the way first replies are after long silences. The second reply was less cautious. By summer, there were letters going in both directions on a regular basis, and when Evelyn read them at the kitchen table in the evenings, she did so with an expression that was complicated in the way that repaired things are always complicated. Not the simplicity of something that was never broken, but something more textured and, in its own way, more durable. Tommy Fitch turned 20 in June, and the crew made a cake, which was Evelyn's idea executed with considerable input from Dale Pruitt, who turned out to have an opinion about cake that no one had previously suspected. Tommy was embarrassed by the attention, and ate 3 slices and then pretended he hadn't. Dalton Pierce's eldest son started coming over occasionally to help with fence work, which was a thin excuse to keep talking to Tommy and probably the beginning of a friendship that would outlast most of the circumstances that had produced it. Cleet Bowman was never replaced directly. The crew ran at 11 for several months, and then Dale hired a young man from Rollins named Victor, who was quiet and capable, and took 2 months to say anything beyond what the work required, but turned out, once he started talking, to have a dry humor that Red Hargrave found funnier than anything Red found funny, which was its own kind of revelation. The document that Bowe and Webb assembled, the clear record of Meridian's tactics in the Carbon County dispute, was sent to the territorial governor's office, to Frey's land office, and through Frey's connections to county recorders in 4 neighboring counties. Whether it protected anyone specifically or how was impossible to trace directly. But it existed in the record, which was what Evelyn had said it needed to do. Not everything useful announces its results. Edmund Crail's name appeared once more, the following winter, in a brief notice in the Cheyenne paper about a business dispute between Western Capital Partners and a Colorado mining concern. He was not described as losing the dispute, but he was not described as winning it either, which told a story of its own. Meridian Land Company as a registered entity dissolved its Wyoming territorial standing sometime that autumn, which Frey noted in a brief letter to Bowe without particular commentary. Some things end not with a scene, but with a clerical notation, and that is perhaps fitting for operations that were never meant to be visible in the first place. The ridge acquired, in time, a small switching station at its base, a modest structure by railroad standards, but solid, positioned exactly where Thomas Barker's survey had identified as the optimal approach point. Bowe rode out to look at it when construction was complete, on a cold morning in November with frost still on the grass and the sky the particular pale gray of late autumn in Wyoming. He sat on his horse and looked at the structure for a while, thinking about his grandfather fencing this edge of the land without knowing what he was marking, and his father surveying it with a man named Cutler whose licensing records had nearly undone everything, and the long patience of land that simply sits and waits while the people around it figure out what it's for. He turned his horse back toward the ranch and rode home. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when he came in, going through the quarterly accounts with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. She looked up when he came through the door. "How does it look?" she asked. "Like a switching station," he said. "Nothing special." She went back to the accounts. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her and looked at the numbers she was working through, following the logic of them, which he could do more easily now than he could 6 months ago because she'd taught him how she read them without making a lesson of it. The fire in the stove made its low, steady sound. Outside, someone crossed the yard. Dale, from the footstep, heading toward the barn. The ranch was at work the way it was always at work, in the 100 small simultaneous ways that never stop when a place is alive and properly run. There is something that people who have built good lives understand, usually only in retrospect, and usually only after losing something and having to build again. That wealth is not in any single thing, but in the accumulation of things that hold together. A piece of land is just a piece of land. Money is just money. What makes either of them worth having is the web of people and trust and daily honest effort that surrounds them, without which they are simply assets waiting to be taken by whoever wants them more badly. Bowe Ashford had more money now than he'd had a year ago, because of the railroad access income and the secured value of the eastern parcel and the efficiencies that a properly run ranch produces over time. He was, by any ledger's accounting, wealthier than he'd been the morning he read Clara Wither's sister's letter at the kitchen table and decided not to answer it. But that was not the thing he thought about when he thought about what the year had given him. What it had given him was the table across from Evelyn, and Dale in the dining room with his coat off, and Tommy Fitch who had stopped eating like he expected someone to take his plate away. It was Red Hargrave's laugh that surprised everyone, including Red, when it arrived. It was Dalton Pierce on the porch in the dark saying the feel of it, the way your men are. It was Margaret Solis in Rollins, a woman he'd never met, pulling a document from the county records that saved his family's land because Evelyn had asked her to look. It was all of that held together, every thread dependent on every other thread, the whole thing fragile and strong simultaneously in the way that only living things are, that can be damaged and repaired, and that grow differently after damage, not back to what they were before, but forward into something that carries the mark of surviving and is stronger in that specific shape. He looked at Evelyn across the table. She was frowning slightly at a column of figures that wasn't adding up the way she expected, which was an expression he'd seen enough times to know meant she'd find the error in the next 2 minutes. "The November supply invoice," he said. "There's a double entry on the salt." She looked up, then she looked at the page and found it. You're right, she said, with the faint tone of someone who would have found it herself and is mildly annoyed at being beaten to it. He picked up his coffee. I notice things, he said. It's habit. She looked at him for a moment with the direct, unguarded expression she didn't always let people see. Then she went back to the accounts, and the correction was small, and the numbers balanced, and outside the kitchen windows the Ashford land stretched east to the ridge, and beyond it the sky. And the morning was all the things a Wyoming morning is. Hard and cold and bright and open in the particular way of places that don't apologize for requiring something from the people who live on them. And the people who lived on this one had decided, without any formal announcement or ceremony, that the requiring was worth it. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.